Jennifer Winter is a troubled teenager who's growing up on the wrong side of the tracks. She's working in a shoe store to pay her way through high school.
I didn't really have family. I did live with my mother, but she ran away with a man she met that was traveling from Australia and left me and my sisters. It was very bad. I don't feel sorry for myself at all. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Jennifer had a very tough childhood. She was on her own. This was someone that had to grow up very, very quickly, and I think lacked that stability in her life.
Jennifer is only 15 when Cristobal Palacio strolls in one afternoon. An immigrant from Nicaragua, he's 6 years older and working in finance.
Cristobal came from a middle-class Nicaraguan family, and they were good people. A decent family, a working family here in Miami.
He was in his early 20s and was already working at Citibank.
My name is Cristobal.
Cristobal was a bank investigator. His job was to investigate fraud claims within the bank. He was the guy that would fill out the police report whenever fraud claims were made by consumers on the bank.
He carried a gun and all of that, and that was his job.
Jennifer is charmed. Cristobal is unlike any man she's ever met in her tough Miami neighborhood.
He was so polite and thoughtful. It gave me a sense of I could trust him.
Here's someone, immigrant, success story, someone that would be a pillar of the community.
They're both lonely and in need of a friend.
And we were talking, and he said, "Would you like to go to dinner?" And I'm like, "Not on a date. I'm not interested in that." No. Just, come hang out. We'll just hang out. I'm like, okay.
I have to admit that at first I didn't really like you. Sorry.
He was a good friend. He took me out all the time. He liked to hang out. He liked to go places and do things. He made it very clear that he had feelings for me and I was not attracted to him at all. I emotionally didn't want to be with anyone.
Well, thank you. This is really nice.
He said it was okay. He understood and he just wanted to be friends and that was fine.
Anyway, thank you for accepting. I really appreciate it.
Never put a hand on me. Never tried to kiss me. Never was, in the Latin culture, as they would say, disrespectful. He understood that I had been through something very traumatic and seemed okay with it.
In fact, Jennifer is recovering from an incident that left her deeply scarred.
I was 14 or 15. I had been raped. So I never really trusted men, I think, from that moment on.
Psychotherapist Stacy Kaiser and forensic psychologist Brian Russell believe the rape would have had a profound effect on Jennifer.
A rape at any age is violating and traumatic. But for a teenager whose identity is developing and they probably haven't had any sexual experiences, it could be truly impactful.
It can cause problems that persist into adulthood because it can make it difficult for someone to know who to trust and who to form good, healthy relationships with in adulthood.
I think it's really wonderful that Jennifer has met Cristobal because she's found a man that she can trust, someone that she feels like she can lean on, and she needs that.
It could be good, but you want to beware of anybody who seems overly needy or overly interested in rescuing, because both of those personality types are often disordered.
After 5 years, Jennifer and Cristobal have grown closer, and now, especially now, she needs a loyal friend.
I started getting sick. At that point, it was severe headaches. Debilitating headaches. I couldn't even lift my head sometimes. Started developing very strange skin lesions, and my doctor had no idea what it was.
I'm a little scared.
They tested me for meningitis and dengue and a lot of other things, thinking maybe I had picked up something from a mosquito bite or something. My doctor told me, "I have no idea what's wrong with you."
She needed somebody to take care of her and to, help her out.
Cristobal comes to the rescue.
He told me, let me take care of you. I've got amazing health insurance. I'll put you on the insurance. I'll take care of you. And, we'll figure out what's wrong with you. The gratitude that I felt of thinking that this person cared so much about me. I thought he was just the sweetest person on earth. I really did.
I made a key to a copy of the key to my house. Here's the key, and I know how you feel, so you have your own room.
Jennifer craved the stability and the rock of this older man who was saying, listen, I'll take care of you.
With no one else to turn to and her health in decline, Jennifer agrees to move in with Cristobal.
I'm not feeling well.
He picked me up and took me there, and he took care of me.
As Jennifer settles into her new home, she notices that something seems different about Cristobal.
That was when he changed. It was night and day. It was instantaneous the second we were both living in that apartment.
Jennifer. Have a good day.
What are you doing?
In his mind, he owned me. So he would literally lock me in and take the phone so I couldn't call anyone.
Joking, right?
She started realizing that he was very controlling, very possessive.
He put a deadbolt on the door that could only be opened with a key, and he had the only key. So he would literally lock me in and take the phone so I couldn't call anyone.
He monitored her where she was at all times. If she was going to leave the apartment, he wanted to know where she was going, how long she was going to be there.
Jennifer! Jennifer!
If I had to go across the street to the grocery store, he would tell me, you have 15 minutes.
15 minutes starts now.
In spite of everything, Jennifer needs Cristobal and the prison he's created for her.
That was who he was, and that was how it was going to be.
I think there's two possible scenarios going on here. One is that Cristobal feels very protective of Jennifer. She's not well, and so he wants to keep a good eye on her because he cares. And the second possible scenario is that he now sees her as a possession, that he feels like he owns her and he can control her.
This is a relationship that's born of obligation, and Jennifer is likely to put up with a higher degree of control for a longer time than she should because of that sense of obligation, and Cristobal is likely to feel entitled to things from Jennifer because he's providing for her.
This kind of controlling behavior raises a lot of red flags for me. A person who is controlling tends to escalate if they don't get what they want. And my concern is that if Jennifer doesn't conform, that Cristobal may get worse.
Although the cause of Jennifer's illness is still a mystery, her health improves, for now. And she's also learning how to live under Cristobal's control.
During that time, there were still times where we got along, and he was normal. I started learning, you know what? Why don't you go to the grocery store with me instead of being timed?
She's only beginning to grasp how troubled he is.
His father was very abusive towards his mother. I know that. She told me that.
Here you go. It's your family, isn't it? Hey.
Take that picture and put it in the garbage.
She always said to me, I tried so hard to raise him to be good, but he didn't ever want to see his family. He would go months without doing anything but go to work and come home and sleep.
It concerns me that Cristobal doesn't have a good relationship with his family or very many friends, because what it tells me is that he's very in need of someone, and Jennifer has become that someone. Somebody who was psychologically savvy might worry that he was suffering from some sort of depression, but my guess is that Jennifer's happy that he's quiet and leaving her alone, and she's okay with it.
Cristobal seems to be quite socially isolated, and one of the negative repercussions of that can be that the person greatly overvalues one individual with whom they make a relationship, because that individual essentially represents all of their social support system.
That may be part of why he's so controlling. It's all he has, and he doesn't want to lose her.
I can't take this anymore.
Almost a year after Jennifer moves in, her health takes a turn for the worse. But Cristobal hasn't kept his promise to put her on his insurance.
Okay.
There was this promise of, you're going to get insurance and then we'll find out what's wrong with you. And just waiting. So at 21 years old, I didn't want to die. I didn't want to be blind. It was hard, and he knew it.
There's a reason she can't be covered. They aren't married.
I called before him for the Palacio marriage license, please.
And he said, fine, come on. And he takes me probably 3-4 miles away. And this is the courthouse.
Sign it.
You want your insurance? I'm gonna get your insurance. It was just literally walked up, want to get married. Give me your ID, sign this, okay, you're married.
They become husband and wife on January 11th, 1995. Jennifer is 23 years old. Cristobal is almost 30.
Now I could see doctors without having to beg him. Part of me felt like I had sold my soul.
Thanks to her new health insurance, Jennifer finally gets a diagnosis.
I have lupus? Oh my God.
Lupus is an autoimmune disorder. Basically, my body's immune system is attacking my organs all the time. Do go into remission, and then that's why I would get a little bit better sometimes.
Now that doctors can treat the problem, her health improves. So much so, she starts working again. To begin with, she works as a babysitter. Then she starts her own nanny business.
I have clients that come to me looking for a good nanny and housekeepers, all of that kind of thing.
Great.
And so I try to match up people that I think will get along.
The business is doing well, so she's feeling much better and much more powerful in her life.
Slappy will be ready in an hour.
Best of all, Cristobal seems at ease with Jennifer's growing independence. Their relationship has never been better.
I felt like I had my friend back. We would go to the movies, we would go out to dinner, we would hang out.
They would go for weeks at a time and everything would be fine.
This unconventional marriage seems to be working out until Jennifer takes the relationship to the next level.
I told him I want a baby.
At that point, all hell broke loose.
Jennifer Winter and Cristobal Palacio get married so that she can be covered by his health insurance. And their relationship is improving. But there's still something missing in Jennifer's
I
life.
told him I want a baby.
There's just one problem. Their relationship is still platonic.
Of course, he wanted to have a normal married life to some extent because I had been through the rape. I didn't want that, and I told him I didn't want that.
Cristobal agrees to Jennifer's wishes. They conceive in vitro.
Finally got pregnant with him in 2000.
But with the arrival of twins, their marriage takes a turn for the worse.
Cristobal, I need help. We need to hire someone to help me.
The babies had been home for about a month and a half, and my lupus had begun to flare, and I was getting really sick. And I said to him, I need a little bit of help.
I'll buy the diapers, I'll buy the clothes, but I am not hiring anybody to be the mother. You are the mother.
Jennifer copes as best she can, but it's getting harder every day.
Everything just got really bad after the kids were born. The controlling is getting worse, the quiet mood swings, that everything's just getting worse in the relationship at that point.
But something has changed for Jennifer. As a mother, she finds she is less and less willing to give in to her husband.
There was an incident when my son was about 10 months old. He was born severely cross-eyed, and we had to patch his eye to try to strengthen the muscle. And we were out one day, and he said, "You're doing it wrong."
Straighten out. My son is not going to be cross-eyed, okay?
No, that's it. My son's not going to be cross-eyed. That's why I'm going to listen to the doctor.
And he said, "If that's my kid, you're going to do what I tell you to do."
Don't you ever touch my son like that again.
And that's it. And I said, no, I'm not going to do the wrong thing for my child. I'm going to do it the way the doctor told me to do it. And I don't care what you say.
When the twins were born, it really gave Jennifer a sense of empowerment. It gave her the backbone to really stand up to Cristobal.
Hello?
I called the doctor the next morning and I told him the whole incident. And the doctor's nurse called and said, "Your wife is doing it the right way."
But what Cristobal does next is completely unexpected. He goes out and doesn't come back for days.
That was probably the last weekend he spent with us. It was almost like having them drove him out in a way. It was almost as if he felt like I was tied down now and he didn't have to monitor me.
Cristobal never explains where he goes during his absences.
We would go days without seeing him, days. And then as the children got older, it would be almost weeks without seeing him.
Cristobal's rarely home at that point. It's just her and the kids. When he is home, there's nothing but, fighting and discord.
I know he had a girlfriend, at least one. He would sometimes come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, take a shower, maybe sleep for an hour or two, and be gone by 6.
Why were you home so late last night?
Because I was working.
You were working?
Mm-hmm.
Really?
I didn't care. It was peaceful.
Happy birthday!
As the kids get older, Cristobal's absences seem like a blessing.
It was almost like we had our freedom. We had our little way of doing things, and we were happy.
Perfect, good!
Jennifer feels comfortable. She feels, okay, he's gone. I can kind of do my own thing. He can do his own thing. And things sort of just were there in limbo in sort of a coexistence.
You want to get 3 colors the same.
As part of their routine without Cristobal, Jennifer plays online computer games with the children.
So my children were probably 3 or 4 and had started playing an online game. My son is autistic, and the computer really was amazing with him. It brought him out of a shell, and so I encouraged that.
Kids, do you want to go
Through the game, Jennifer meets another parent, a British web designer and single father named Paul Winter.
Paul was a computer geek. He was an easygoing guy. He had a good sense of humor. He's in England. He's got a son.
In the beginning, it wasn't a romantic thing at all between us. I didn't even find him attractive. He sent me a picture of him and his son, and I was not attracted to him at all. We started talking. I happened to mention to him that my favorite singer was Alison Moyet.
Okay, what about this one? What about this one?
My all-time favorite band.
Yes, I do.
And he said something very sarcastic, and I laughed and thought it was really funny, and he says nobody else would have gotten that on here. So it just kind of turned out that we had a lot of things in common. We liked the same music. We liked the same books.
Thinking about doing some traveling.
They really hit it off. I think they just really clicked online.
I'm not lying.
He made me laugh. Just that dry English humor. He was a member of Mensa. He had an IQ of 154. He literally was a genius. He could look at things and instantly see something that another person may never see. It was just instant with him. That to me was incredibly hot.
Jennifer is finally in a state of calm in her life. She's raising her children, Cristobal's not around, and it's almost like she can relax. And this gives her an opportunity to get to know herself, to really think about what she wants and needs.
The fact that Jennifer is starting a new relationship online while still in her marriage with Cristobal is never a good idea. The solution to an unhappy marriage is never to go out and bring a third party into it.
I don't agree. I think Paul is filling a hole for Jennifer. I think he's solving her problems. It's somebody that she feels connected with. It's something she's never had before.
I'm stuck here and I got 2 kids with him.
As their friendship deepens, Jennifer opens up to Paul.
I confided in him. He knew it was bad. He knew that I was always alone.
Though Cristobal doesn't know about Paul, he can sense something's going on.
Have a good day.
He starts to spend more time at home, where he can keep an eye on his wife. Finally, Jennifer comes to a decision. She wants to end her marriage to Cristobal.
She's got somebody now that is, for the first time in her life, giving her confidence, treating her well. You know, he treats her wonderfully and says great things to her and compliments her, and she loves it.
I told him I found an apartment. I was leaving. At first he flew into a rage, and then all of a sudden, you know what? Just go. Just go. It's fine.
Cristobal's reaction to Jennifer's announcement that she's leaving is a little bit surprising because he's been quite controlling throughout the course of the marriage, and he seems to sort of give up rather easily.
The fact that Cristobal was so willing to let Jennifer go tells me how much distance there was between them.
I think it's highly likely that Cristobal felt used and betrayed, as if she had taken away from him something which he had earned by providing for her for all of those years.
Let's go. Let's go, kids. Come on.
1 month later, Jennifer files for divorce. Cristobal doesn't take it well.
Let's get in the car.
You're not gonna win this.
But while Jennifer's marriage with Cristobal is coming to an end, her relationship with Paul is entering a new phase.
He called me and told me that he was coming to see his father and he was going to fly into Miami.
I had to see you. I was in Florida anyway, and I thought I'd...
What do you...
Well,
I don't even know what to say.
I know.
It was just a little weird. I was so nervous and I wasn't expecting him to kiss me, and he did, and it was like, okay.
Jennifer soon realizes she's falling hard for Paul, and he feels the same way.
I got more comfortable around him, and eventually, yeah, there was a little spark when he would kiss me, and it just kind of, it was nice.
Their relationship really blossomed quite quickly. She really considered him the rock and the love of her life.
He went to go see his father, and then he came back to Miami, and he was supposed to get on a plane.
I really can't imagine it without you anymore, and I don't want to go.
And don't.
He was only going to stay a couple of weeks, and he stayed a couple of months. That he decided that he's going to go move over here and be with her full time.
Paul moves in and helps Jennifer run her nanny and housekeeping agency.
Oh, I like the pink one.
She can't wait for her divorce to come through so she can make her relationship with Paul official.
Paul was, at this point, illegal in this country. He had overstayed his visa. And the only way you can correct that is to get married and put in the appropriate paperwork.
Finally, Jennifer and Cristobal's divorce is finalized.
Their marriage was over. She told me that she and her husband pretty much didn't have much of a relationship for about 6 years.
3 days after Jennifer's divorce becomes final, she marries Paul Winter. They don't have time or money for a ceremony.
We were married on Friday by my divorce lawyer because we thought that was kind of funny to have a divorce lawyer marry us.
The two of them came in, we talked, and I married them by signing off as a notary.
We loved each other very much and wanted to be married. And I wanted to have that, see what that was like to have someone that respected me and trusted me. And it was good.
But Jennifer's problems with her ex Cristobal are far from over. In fact, they are only just beginning.
Constantly threatening me.
This guy won't go away, and he's hell-bent on making problems.
Jennifer and Cristobal Palacios' divorce is finalized. She hopes to put their troubled past behind her as she moves in with her new husband, Paul.
She's elated. This is everything she's wanted in life. She finally has a good relationship. She has her 2 kids that she adores. She has a career that's going well. Her life was finally coming together.
But there's one dark spot in Jennifer's life, the tense relationship with her paranoid ex-husband.
Cristobal was convinced that Jennifer and Paul had it out for him. He's just trying to move on with his life, and they just won't let him go.
when I can or can't see
Don't
my
tell
kids.
me what to do.
Soon, they're arguing regularly over custody of the children. Despite years of neglect, Cristobal now jealously fights for time with the kids.
Jennifer, I want
No,
my kids
you
on
know what? We're
Friday.
gonna settle this in court. We'll settle it in court.
The custody situation was always very, very tumultuous between them. It really devolved into bitter infighting about, you're late, where are we going to pick up the person, where are we going to pick up the kids today?
Jennifer and Cristobal were taking turns taking the other one to court. So if one didn't like something the other one did, they'd go to court and have a judge settle it. They were spending a lot of money on lawyers at that point.
Cristobal has never cared about his kids before. And I think that the reason he cares now is because he wants to hurt Jennifer. He knows that she is so connected to those children that if he can get them, it will cause her pain.
As the couple's arguments escalate, Jennifer's new husband, Paul, is pulled into the fray.
Paul just didn't like the way Cristobal would treat them when he came over there to get the kids. He would upset Jennifer, he'd pick a fight with her, and then he would ridicule her and scream at her and yell at her and all that kind of thing, and Paul didn't like that.
He's trying to be her rescuer, he's trying to be her hero. It makes me nervous that Paul is in the middle of this relationship between Jennifer and Cristobal.
Cristobal's run-ins with Paul become more heated, to the point where he makes a complaint to the police.
Cristobal's saying that there were some situations between he and Paul that things got out of hand. Paul pulled out a gun and pointed it towards Cristobal and kind of threatened him.
New husband of my ex-wife is a
Cristobal claimed that Paul was threatening him physically, saying he was going to beat him up, that he was going to kill him, that he was going to harm him in many ways.
He made numerous phone calls to the police that we were following him and stalking him.
The tensions between Cristobal, Jennifer, and Paul reach a boiling point, and now the conflict draws in the children as well.
Cristobal found some kind of a mark on one of the children. He develops this idea that Paul is somehow abusing the children.
She's had someone move into her
Cristobal even files a complaint with Florida's Department of Children and Families.
Based on these allegations of abuse, the department did open up an investigation.
No, he hit you here. Here, see? Did he hit you there?
Yeah.
See the bruise? You see that?
Paul was accused of child abuse 13 times in less than 2 years.
Paul at this point is, he's upset. I mean, this guy won't go away, and he's, hell-bent on making problems for Paul and Jennifer.
New husband, Paul abusing the children, filed by the father 5 days after the alleged assault.
It's been exactly 2 years since Jennifer decided to leave Cristobal, and relations are worse than ever. Things come to a head one weekend in 2008. It's Cristobal's turn to get the kids, but Jennifer believes she should have them.
That weekend was Jennifer's birthday, and she normally had the kids on her birthday.
They both show up to pick the children up. Jennifer shows up and Cristobal shows up at the school.
This is my birthday, and I asked you 3 weeks ago.
And I said, no, it's my day. I get to have him. And then he started trying to rip the backpack off of my arm and said, we're going to do homework, we're going to do homework. Give me the backpack.
The kids are starting to get upset because these two are fighting again. And at some point, Jennifer ends up with, the backpack and the kids. Cristobal leaves empty-handed that day.
Yay!
That evening, Jennifer celebrates. She's 37 years old. But she and Paul are anxious about the conflict with Cristobal.
Paul, at this point, says to her, listen, we don't need any more trouble with this guy. Why don't we just let him have the kids today and we'll celebrate your birthday next weekend? So Jennifer called him up.
What do you want me to do?
And he says, bring them back tonight. And he hung up. That was it. So we had been originally intending to take the kids out for dinner, maybe go down to the Keys for the evening. So it turned into we'll drop them off and then we'll go see a movie.
Hey, kids!
Parked on the street. The children got out of the car and went up to the door and knocked on the door and rang the doorbell and waited a few minutes.
But something's not quite right.
He didn't answer the door. Nobody answered the door. Both his car and his girlfriend's car were there. Okay, well, my daughter turned around and looked at me like, what do you want me to do, Mommy? I got out and went and rang the bell. I gave each of the kids a kiss on their head and said, just hold on.
Come on.
But it doesn't take long before the unimaginable happens.
Why are we doing my Chris? Look, you are not the father.
And I'm screaming and screaming and screaming.
It's Jennifer Winter's birthday. She and her ex, Cristobal Palacio, are arguing bitterly over the children. At the urging of her new husband, Paul, they try to drop off the kids at Cristobal's. But no one's answering the door. They're on the verge of giving up and going home. Cristobal can't hear them.
He's in the backyard. He hears just unrelenting honking in a very, very rude and aggressive type way, just honking and honking and honking.
Jennifer can't understand why Cristobal isn't coming to the door. She decides to give up.
Grabbed my son's hand and got back in the car. And we were getting ready to leave.
The next thing you know, they see Cristobal appear in the doorway.
I could hear him screaming, cursing, just cursing and screaming from his door. And Paul said, he's the one who told us to come here and drop them off. What is wrong with him?
Kidding me?
No, I'll be right back. Everything all right? I'll be right back.
Get out!
He was annoyed. Like, we brought the kids over and we've been sitting here for 10 minutes knocking on the door. He walks around the front of the van and he yells up to Cristobal, what are you doing? You know, why are you doing this?
We know that you are not the father. We called. You are not.
He sees Paul coming at him aggressively.
Oh, really? Yes.
He saw him reaching for something like in his waistband. He was in fear for his life, so he had to open fire preemptively to save his own life.
There were 8 rounds that were fired, and all but one, I believe, made contact.
No! Why did you do that?
And I'm screaming and screaming and screaming.
Chris, what's happening?
Cristobal's girlfriend saw that there was some sort of altercation. She just heard the gunshots.
Do something! What's the matter with you?
By the time she dials 911, Paul is already dead.
Aren't you with me? You shot him? Yes. You coming after me in my house. My wife's husband.
The detectives took him back to the Homicide Bureau and they interviewed him.
Detectives find Cristobal surprisingly cooperative.
He was charging, he was screaming, he was swearing. I was saying, Paul, calm down, calm down.
He gives a voluntary statement to the homicide detectives that are investigating the murder. There's no disputing what happened. He shot him. He completely takes responsibility for shooting Paul.
I'm not surprised at all that the growing tensions between Paul and Cristobal ended in violence. Some people become violent and aggressive because they're angry and confrontational, like Cristobal. Other people could become violent and aggressive out of protection, out of defensiveness. And so either of these two people would be capable of harming someone, even though they're coming from two totally different places.
Cristobal probably felt that Paul had what was his and had taken it from him to some degree. And Paul probably felt like he needed to step up and be knight in shining armor for Jennifer. That can be a volatile combination of people.
I was saying, Paul, calm down.
As detectives interrogate him, Cristobal insists he had good reason to shoot Paul. Self-defense.
This guy lives with my children. I was afraid he was...
Cristobal said that he, at that point, felt in fear because Paul was advancing on him in a threatening manner.
He said Paul had a gun or a knife or something and was running at him.
He felt like he had no choice but to pull out his gun and to fire it.
Cristobal's story seems watertight, but this case is anything but.
This is not a whodunit. We knew who shot him. The question became, was he justified in doing it?
He didn't mean to do it.
With his right hand, he reached behind him. And I knew.
Cristobal Palacio says he was justified in shooting Jennifer's new husband, claiming that Paul was about to pull a gun on him. But his story starts to fall apart when police examine the crime scene and find no trace of the weapon that Paul was supposedly carrying.
No gun was ever recovered from Paul's body, whether at the morgue, whether at the autopsy, at the hospital, at the scene.
Paul wasn't armed. He did not have a weapon.
But even more incriminating is the account by Jennifer and the kids, who witnessed the entire thing.
Paul got out of the car. The intent was to say, you told us to be here.
Look, Chris. This is my go with my kids. Chris. My go with my kids. They are not.
Paul, he was just walking on the driveway in an attempt to try to get the kids into the house.
He saw Paul, and he smiled. Like he had just won the lottery. He stopped and he lifted up his shirt with his left hand, and with his right hand he reached behind him. And I knew. I remember screaming, oh my God, Paulie's got a gun.
And Cristobal opens up and just unloads a volley of gunfire.
He's firing as he walks, and he walks right up to Paul and fires at him, and then even shoots him a few times while he's laying on the ground.
Basically, the twins were right there watching as their father came out shooting at their stepfather.
Cristobal shoots Paul 9 times. One shot blew off Paul's finger. One of the shots severed Paul's spine, so even if Paul had survived this shooting, he would have been paralyzed. One of the shots was through the heart.
By the time Jennifer reaches Paul, he's dying.
Tried doing CPR, tried to get him breathing. And as I lifted up Paul's shirt to try to look, I knew it was pointless.
Paul's wounds were fatal. There was no way he would survive.
Cristobal tells detectives that Paul had been threatening him for months and that he had reported the threats to police. But these reports were never substantiated. Detectives also learn about Cristobal's allegations that Paul was abusing the children.
My daddy told me to say that.
None of them were ever found to be true. There was never any proof to corroborate these allegations.
Ultimately, the Department of Children and Families realized that the kids were being coached and that they were being told to say this and told to lie, basically. They deemed the allegations as not being credible.
I really think that Cristobal had 2 things in the works. First of all, he wanted to destroy Paul's reputation and image. Secondly, he was setting up an explanation for why he might need to shoot him, that he was retaliating, that he had been hurt, and that this was a bad man that he was killing.
At the heart of virtually every sociopathic act is narcissism, a sense of entitlement to indulge the self at the expense of others. And so I think what we see coming out of Cristobal is a sense of entitlement to avenge what he probably actually believed was a huge betrayal of him by Jennifer and by Paul.
Turns out it's not the first time Cristobal has pulled a gun on someone. He's also pulled one on Jennifer. It happened years before, when Jennifer took too long at the grocery store.
The store was crazy busy. It was so crowded. And I got back and I opened the door and started to say something like, oh my gosh, it's crazy in there. You should have seen it. And he slammed the door behind me and he grabbed me. I remember just staring at him and I'm crying. And he's just saying, I told you, you had 15 minutes. Next time you're going to listen to me, aren't you?
It became a very terrible relationship. There was a lot of emotional violence as well as physical abuse.
I used to go into the bedroom that I shared with the children and I would lock the door. But I think I had become complacent because he hadn't ever really been around much anymore. And I left the door unlocked. And I woke up one morning and my daughter wasn't there. And my heart started pounding. And I just knew something was wrong. And I went out in the living room.
I'm gonna kill them.
And he was sitting on the couch. And she was next to him. And he saw me and he smiled. And he had the gun in his hand.
I know you're thinking of leaving me. And if you do, I'm gonna kill them both.
And if you do, I'm gonna make sure that you watch each one of them die. And you're gonna watch them both die before I kill you.
Jennifer believes Cristobal had been planning Paul's murder since the day she left him.
Come on, kids, come on, let's get in the car.
It was the revenge that he wanted. That's all that it meant.
Cristobal goes on trial. and he himself is the star witness.
He was running at me, and he looked like he was coming with a gun. I shot him. His knee buckled, and he went down to the ground.
He testified fairly well for a defendant. He got emotional, he cried in all the right points. He definitely portrayed himself as the victim in this whole scenario.
Cristobal tries to paint Paul as the aggressor.
If my husband wasn't dead, it would be laughable. Really. Paul was the most gentle person you would ever in your life meet.
He didn't fit the profile of the menacing, angry man who had a vendetta against the ex-husband. That wasn't him at all.
Cristobal argues that under Florida's controversial Stand Your Ground law, he was entitled to protect himself against Paul.
This was not an easy case for the prosecution, and here's why. Cristobal was at home. He cooperated completely. Who's to say that he didn't fear for his life? Who's to say that he did not feel threatened at his own property?
In the end, the jury comes back with a conviction, but on a lesser charge of second-degree murder.
The verdict itself was a slap in the face. He committed murder, cold-blooded murder, in front of children. And that's all he got?
He was sentenced in the end to 45 years in prison, and he was given a 30-year minimum mandatory sentence. So he'll do at least 30 years plus a good chunk of the final 15 years.
Paul Winter leaves behind a young son in England and a grieving family in Miami.
Paul came here because he thought he found the right woman, and got together with her and was basically just living his life over here. So he got killed over what that day?
I'll always remember, but I don't cry. My husband lost his life, but my children and I gained our safety and our freedom, and we're so thankful to Paul for that. He gave us the ultimate gift. There are days that I'll hear a song and I'll go, oh, and he's not there. It doesn't go away. It doesn't stop. I miss Paul a lot.
The South Pacific Ocean is not merely a body of water. It is a sprawling, incomprehensible expanse that swallows light, sound, and human endeavor with absolute indifference. When we think of the islands scattered across this massive blue void, our minds often gravitate toward idyllic imagery. We picture swaying palm trees, pristine white beaches, and waters so transparent they seem woven from glass. But beneath this tranquil veneer lies a profound, terrifying isolation. To be caught in the middle of the Pacific is to be entirely disconnected from the safety nets of civilization. There is no immediate rescue. There is no authority. There is only the horizon, stretching endlessly in every direction, forming a perfect, inescapable circle around whoever dares to traverse it. In the mid-1970s, before the advent of ubiquitous satellite tracking and instant global communication, this isolation was absolute. A ship venturing into these waters was effectively leaving the known world behind, stepping off the edge of the map into a realm where the laws of nature and the fragility of the human mind were the only governing forces. At the very edge of this profound isolation lies Rose Atoll. Geographically, it holds the distinction of being the southernmost point of territory belonging to the United States, but politically and culturally, it feels entirely detached from any mainland concept of governance. It is a tiny, remote coral reef, an uninhabited speck of land rising precariously from the abyssal depths of the ocean. The atoll itself is breathtakingly beautiful, characterized by its distinctive pink coral and algae and the vibrant, teeming marine life that shelters within its lagoon. Yet, it is a beauty accompanied by a profound stillness, a place where the sound of the ocean crashing against the outer reef is the only voice to be heard. For the local communities of American Samoa, Rose Atoll is not simply a geographical footnote. It is a place of deep spiritual significance. The traditional belief systems acknowledge the existence of ancient spirits, the Aitu, which are said to act as guardians of these sacred and touched spaces. The folklore surrounding the atoll carries a quiet, unspoken warning. It is a domain that demands respect. To violate the sanctity of these waters, to bring malice, bloodshed, or dark intentions into the presence of the Aitu, is to invite a terrible and inescapable retribution. The locals understand that the ocean does not simply absorb violence. It reflects it, amplifies it, and ultimately consumes those who perpetrate it. It was into this vast, spiritually charged, and profoundly isolated region that a commercial fishing vessel found itself drifting aimlessly in the middle of the decade. The ship, believed to be registered in Taiwan or operating under a local joint venture, was a creature of utility built not for comfort but for the grueling, unrelenting extraction of resources from the sea. Commercial fishing in the 1970s, particularly in the deep Pacific, was an industry defined by its harshness. Crews were composed of men from various nations, often thrown together by economic necessity, bound to a floating platform of wood and rusting metal for months on end. The physical environment aboard such a vessel was a crucible of human endurance. The spaces were incredibly narrow, forcing men to live, eat, sleep, and work shoulder to shoulder in an environment saturated with the inescapable stench of diesel fuel, salt, and decaying fish. The dampness was pervasive, seeping into the wooden planks, the bedding, and the very bones of the men on board. The constant, rhythmic rocking of the ship, the relentless pounding of the waves, and the ceaseless drone of the engine created an auditory prison, a sensory overload that never truly abated. Psychologically, the toll of such an environment is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Modern psychology refers to the phenomenon as cabin fever, a severe form of claustrophobia and psychological distress brought on by prolonged confinement in a tight space. On a fishing vessel thousands of miles from land, cabin fever is not merely a feeling of restlessness. It is an existential threat. The isolation breeds paranoia. Minor grievances, magnified by the inescapable proximity of others and the grueling physical labor, can fester into deep-seated resentments. The sheer monotony of the horizon, and changing day after day, can fracture a fragile psyche. Men pushed to the brink of physical exhaustion, deprived of the stabilizing influences of family, society, and terra firma, can find their moral compasses slowly degrading. The thin veneer of civilization, carefully maintained on land, can peel away under the relentless friction of life at sea, exposing raw, volatile human nature. It is a pressure cooker environment where a single spark of conflict has the potential to ignite a devastating inferno. This was the reality of the floating world that drifted silently into the vicinity of Rose Atoll. To the casual observer, perhaps a passing seabird or a distant merchant vessel, there might have been nothing immediately anomalous about the silhouette of the fishing boat rocking gently in the swells. It was simply a ship on the water. But as a United States Coast Guard patrol vessel approached the area, the illusion of normalcy quickly evaporated. In the open ocean, a ship without purpose is a glaring anomaly. A vessel that does not respond to radio calls, that drifts at the mercy of the current rather than carving a deliberate path through the water, is an immediate cause for alarm. The Coast Guard crew, trained to read the language of the sea, would have recognized the warning signs immediately. The fishing vessel was completely dark, devoid of the operational lights that should have been burning. There was no movement on the deck, no figures working the lines or standing watch. The silence radiating from the ship was not the peaceful quiet of a resting crew, but a heavy, unnatural stillness that seemed to swallow the ambient noise of the ocean. As the patrol boat drew closer, maneuvering cautiously alongside the drifting vessel, the sense of dread among the Coast Guard personnel would have been palpable. The sea state around Rose Atoll, while often calm, still commanded respect, and boarding an unresponsive ship in the open ocean is a deeply perilous operation. But it was not the physical danger that chilled the boarding party. It was the overwhelming atmosphere of abandonment. The hull of the fishing boat, battered by the elements, offered no clues. When the first personnel stepped over the rail and onto the wooden deck, the only sound was the creaking of the ship's timbers and the rhythmic slapping of water against the hull. The air was thick, carrying the familiar odors of a working vessel, but underneath that mundane scent was something sharper, something coppery and disturbing. The deck was eerily deserted. Tools and fishing gear lay exactly where they had been dropped, suggesting a sudden and catastrophic interruption of daily routines. It was as if the entire crew had simply vanished into thin air. The boarding party moved systematically, their training dictating a careful, methodical search of the vessel. They approached the main cabin, the central living and command area of the ship. The door was breached, and as their flashlights pierced the gloom of the interior, the true, horrifying nature of the situation began to reveal itself. The cabin was not merely abandoned, it was a theater of extreme violence. The beams of light illuminated a scene that defied immediate comprehension. Blood was everywhere. It was not just a matter of a few scattered drops. It was a chaotic, violent canvas painted across the bulkheads, pulling on the floorboards, and staining the very fabric of the room. The sheer volume of the crimson stains told a story of frantic, desperate struggles, of life being extinguished in a flurry of chaotic motion. Yet, amidst this horrific display of carnage, a chilling incongruity stood out. The personal belongings of the crew, their clothing, their sparse personal items, whatever meager valuables they possessed remained completely untouched. In the annals of maritime crime, piracy is the most common motivation for boarding a vessel and attacking a crew. Pirates are driven by economics. They strip a ship of its cargo, its equipment, and the personal wealth of its inhabitants. But this scene lacked the frantic, ransacked appearance of a robbery. Drawers were not pulled open, lockers were not smashed, and items of obvious value sat undisturbed beside pools of dried blood. This profound lack of theft was a terrifying revelation for the investigators standing in the cabin. It meant that whoever had perpetrated this violence, whether it was an outside force or an enemy within, was not motivated by financial gain. They were not there to take property, they were there to take lives. The violence was the primary objective. The untouched personal effects whispered a dark truth. The motive for the slaughter was personal, pathological, or born of an unimaginable madness. The boarding party stood in the silent, blood-soaked cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of a crew that had met a violent end, surrounded by an ocean that offered no witnesses and no refuge. The moonlight, reflecting off the calm waters of the lagoon, filtered through the portholes, casting long, eerie shadows across the desecrated space. The gentle, rhythmic rocking of the ship, usually a comforting sensation to a mariner, now felt like the slow, deliberate breathing of a predator that had just finished its meal. They had found the aftermath of a massacre, a localized apocalypse that had consumed the tight-knit world of the fishing vessel, but the cabin was only the beginning. The most profound horrors, the true depths of the depravity that had taken place miles away from any form of justice or salvation, were still waiting to be discovered below the deck. Down in the dark, damp, and inescapable confines of the ship's hold, where the reality of the violence would surpass even their darkest imaginations. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded near the desolate coordinates of Rose Atoll, we must first attempt to understand the men who were on board that drifting vessel. In the realm of true crime, we are usually provided with a clear, defined portrait of the victims. We see their photographs, we learn about their families, their aspirations, their flaws, and the lives that were so violently interrupted. But in this specific case, the victims are shrouded in a devastating, impenetrable anonymity. The historical data tells us that the crew was composed of individuals from various nationalities, a multinational assembly of laborers brought together by the unforgiving demands of the deep-sea fishing industry in the mid-1970s. Because the ship was operating far out in international waters, and because it was believed to be a Taiwanese registered vessel or a complex local joint venture, the bureaucratic records were tangled, fragmented, or lost entirely to the ocean's vast indifference. These men were essentially ghosts before they even died. They were the invisible, disposable workforce of the ocean, men driven by sheer economic necessity to leave their homes and families behind for months, sometimes years, at a time. They traded the stability of land for the brutal, unpredictable reality of a floating factory. The profound tragedy of their deaths is magnified by the tragedy of their erasure. They were swallowed by the sea, both physically and administratively, leaving behind grieving families across the globe who may never have received definitive answers or a body to bury. The geopolitical and economic landscape of the 1970s commercial fishing industry provides the crucial, suffocating backdrop for this nightmare. This was an era long before strict international labor regulations governed the high seas, before satellite tracking and instantaneous communication offered a lifeline to those in peril. A vessel registered under a flag of convenience, operating as a localized joint venture, often meant a complex web of ownership designed strictly to maximize profit and minimize overhead. The ships were purely utilitarian constructs of wood and rusting iron, built for endurance and payload rather than human comfort. For the men who signed the contracts and stepped onto the gangway, the promise of a wage was often the only beacon in a life defined by systemic poverty. These were not men seeking maritime adventure. They were desperate men seeking survival. They came from different countries, different cultures, and different linguistic backgrounds, thrown together into a violently confined space where the only common language was the grueling, relentless labor itself. Imagine the profound psychological isolation of living elbow to elbow with a dozen other men, yet being entirely unable to communicate complex thoughts, share personal fears, or even properly introduce yourself due to insurmountable language barriers. This multinational composition, while economically advantageous for the ship's distant owners, created a highly volatile sociological experiment floating in the middle of nowhere. Cultural misunderstandings, differences in hygiene or daily habits, and the inability to effectively mediate minor, everyday disputes could easily transform a small, damp wooden cabin into an unbearable pressure cooker. When you cannot speak to the man sleeping 3 feet away from you, he easily becomes an unpredictable other, and in the paranoid crucible of the open ocean, that otherness can rapidly be perceived as a direct threat to your existence. The physical environment aboard this specific type of vessel was meticulously designed to break a human being down to their absolute physical and mental limits. Commercial deep-sea fishing is not merely a strenuous job. It is a sustained assault on the senses and the human body. The men on this boat were subjected to grueling shifts that defied any natural circadian rhythm, forced to work frantically under the glare of harsh artificial lights whenever a catch was hauled in. Regardless of whether it was the middle of the day or the dead of night, their hands would have been perpetually calloused, deeply scarred, and stinging from the relentless exposure to freezing saltwater and the sharp, toxic spines of their catch. The tools of their trade were brutal, primitive implements. The initial Coast Guard investigation specifically noted the horrific trauma inflicted by filleting knives and iron hooks, heavy, lethally sharp objects designed to tear through dense muscle, flesh, and bone with brutal, mechanical efficiency. These were not sophisticated weapons of war brought on board for malice. They were the very tools of their sustenance, handled daily with exhausted, numb fingers. The profound horror of the Rose Atoll massacre lies in the grotesque perversion of these everyday objects. The men who died in the dark, suffocating hold of that ship were not killed by firearms or distant artillery. They were slaughtered up close, face to face, with the very instruments they used to earn their meager living. The transformation of a filleting knife from a tool of honest labor into an instrument of frenzied murder represents a terrifying psychological rupture. It signifies a complete, catastrophic collapse of the boundaries between the grueling work that sustained them and the visceral violence that ultimately destroyed them. Furthermore, we must deeply consider the spatial reality of a 1970s fishing boat navigating the deep Pacific. The living quarters were suffocatingly small, resembling a prison cell more than a dormitory. Narrow bunks were likely stacked precariously atop one another in a poorly ventilated, perpetually damp cabin, saturated with the inescapable smell of unwashed bodies, acrid diesel exhaust, and the ever-present, nauseating stench of decaying marine life. Privacy was a physical impossibility. Every cough, every nightmare, every muttered word of frustration was witnessed by everyone else in the room. In such an oppressive environment, the human mind struggles desperately to find equilibrium. The investigative data points toward the psychological phenomenon of cabin fever, But in the context of this isolated, multinational crew, that clinical term feels almost entirely inadequate. It was a complete sensory deprivation combined with an absolute social suffocation. When you are surrounded by the infinite and changing expanse of the South Pacific Ocean, the profound lack of visual stimulation on the horizon forces the mind to turn violently inward. If that internal landscape is fraught with physical exhaustion, deep-seated resentment, and a creeping paranoia exacerbated by the inability to communicate, the psychological deterioration can be rapid, silent, and catastrophic. The men were trapped not just by the rotting wooden hull of the ship, but by the endless, impassable, thousands of miles wide moat of the Pacific. There was no local tavern to blow off steam, no walk around the block to cool a flaring temper, no law enforcement to call to mediate an escalating dispute. They were their own absolute authorities, completely abandoned by civilization, and in the total absence of external societal constraints, the darkest. Most primal impulses of human nature were left entirely unchecked to fester and multiply. The isolation of the crew was absolute, a chilling fact that becomes even more terrifying when we consider their geographical trajectory. They were drifting aimlessly near Rose Atoll, a location defined by its extreme, almost mythical remoteness even within the vastness of the Pacific. As they approached this lonely, silent outpost, the psychological weight of their isolation would have reached its absolute breaking point. They were thousands of miles from the familiar shores, sounds, and smells of their home countries, cut off from any semblance of the lives they once knew. For weeks or perhaps months, their entire universe had been violently confined to a few dozen square feet of blood-stained wood and rusting metal. The sheer, bone-deep physical exhaustion of their labor, combined with the psychological torment of their confinement and the linguistic isolation from their peers, created a highly combustible, inescapable atmosphere. They were a microcosm of a fractured, broken society, floating blindly through an indifferent wilderness. It is vital to empathize with the profound vulnerability of these specific victims. They were not combatants in a war, they were desperate workers. When they closed their eyes in their narrow, damp bunks, they likely dreamt of the families they were providing for, the crushing debts they were paying off, or the simple, impossible comfort of solid ground. They did not anticipate that the greatest threat to their lives would not come from a monstrous typhoon or a catastrophic failure of the ship's engine, but from the exhausted men sleeping in the bunks right beside them. The violence that erupted was an intimate, visceral, and incomprehensible betrayal. To be attacked in the confined, pitch-black space of a ship's hold, surrounded by the deafening, mechanical roar of the engine and the crushing weight of the ocean, is to experience a terror that is almost entirely unimaginable. There was no direction to run, no heavy door to lock, and no one on Earth to hear their screams above the relentless crashing of the waves against the hull. The tragic anonymity of the victims forces us to look at them not as specific individuals, but as silent representatives of a deeply exploited class of people. They highlight the dark, hidden underbelly of global industries that operate violently in the shadows of international waters. Their horrific deaths were a direct, inevitable result of the intersecting forces of economic desperation, extreme physical hardship, and profound, maddening psychological isolation. The ship they worked on was intended to be an instrument of harvest, but under the unbearable, crushing pressure of their circumstances, it was transformed into a floating abattoir. As the vessel drifted silently toward the spiritually charged, silent waters of Rose Atoll, the tension on board must have been palpable, a thick, suffocating dread that hung heavy in the humid, salty air. The precise catalyst for the violence remains permanently locked away in the dark history of that doomed voyage. But the foundation for the massacre was laid long before the first deadly blow was ever struck. It was built into the very structure of their miserable lives, into the grueling labor, the multinational friction, and the inescapable, maddening confinement of the deep sea. They were men pushed past the absolute limits of human sanity and endurance, trapped in a space where logic was a fragile, rapidly eroding commodity, and where the only conceivable escape from the waking nightmare was the dark, freezing, shark-infested embrace of the ocean depths. This was the volatile powder keg that was silently waiting to explode as the ghost ship finally crossed into the lonely, haunted orbit of the Rose Atoll Reef. The precise moment the fragile equilibrium on the fishing vessel finally shattered remains forever lost to the relentless waves of the South Pacific. But we can reconstruct the suffocating atmosphere of that fateful night based on the gruesome, blood-soaked aftermath left behind. Imagine the oppressive, stifling environment of the ship as it drifted in the dark, featureless void near the remote coral reefs of Rose Atoll. The equatorial heat would have been entirely unforgiving, a heavy, humid blanket that trapped the sickening stench of diesel fuel, sweat, and rotting marine life within the degrading wooden confines of the vessel. Deep in the lower hold, the men who were not on active duty would have been collapsed in their narrow, stacked bunks, their bodies physically exhausted beyond the limits of normal human endurance. Sleep in such a confined, wretched place is rarely peaceful. It is a desperate, fitful state of unconsciousness, constantly interrupted by the rhythmic, violent pitching of the ship and the deafening, mechanical heartbeat of the heavy engine vibrating directly beneath their spines. Above deck, the night watch or those processing the day's meager catch would have been moving like hollow automatons, their minds numbed by the sheer monotony of the grueling labor and the hypnotic, endless blackness of the ocean stretching out in every conceivable direction. There was no transition, no warning siren to announce the impending slaughter. The violence did not arrive as a sudden, visible storm gathering on the horizon. It ignited entirely from within, a spontaneous and devastating eruption of pent-up paranoia, insurmountable language barriers, and deep-seated, maddening cabin fever. In a space where men could not escape each other's physical presence or comprehend each other's spoken anxieties, the unbearable tension finally found its release in the most primal and visceral language possible, which was pure, unadulterated physical destruction. The initial spark of the massacre likely occurred in the cramped, suffocating quarters of the lower hold or the main cabin, striking the men when they were at their absolute most vulnerable state. According to the dark forensic reality of the scene discovered later by the Coast Guard, the victims were mercilessly attacked in the midst of their daily routines or while they were completely submerged in sleep. To be violently jolted awake from extreme physical exhaustion by the sudden, excruciating pain of a heavy blade is a terror that defies adequate human description. The claustrophobic darkness of the sleeping quarters would have instantly transformed into a chaotic, unimaginable nightmare of flailing limbs, desperate shouts in multiple, mutually unintelligible languages, and the sickening, wet sound of cold metal tearing rapidly through warm flesh. In the microscopic confines of a commercial fishing boat cabin, there is absolutely no room for evasive maneuvers or strategic defense. A man cannot retreat. He can only attempt to grapple blindly with an unseen, frenzied assailant in a pitch black, violently rocking wooden box. The extreme proximity of the narrow bunk beds meant that the horrific violence inflicted on one man would have immediately splashed heavily onto the man sleeping mere inches above or beside him. Panic, raw and intensely contagious, would have surged through the tight, airless quarters like a lethal electrical current. The men who woke to the suffocating screams of their dying crewmates would have found themselves entirely trapped in a dark labyrinth of narrow corridors and steep ladders. Profoundly disoriented by the sudden chaos and terrified by the realization that the very people they relied upon for daily survival had suddenly morphed into their ruthless executioners. The profound horror of the incident is heavily magnified by the specific, brutal instruments used to carry out the localized slaughter. The attackers did not utilize firearms, which offer a certain mechanical detachment and quickness to the act of killing. Instead, they violently weaponized the very tools of their brutal, everyday trade. The subsequent investigation highlighted the extensive, terrifying use of commercial filleting knives and heavy iron fishing hooks. A professional filleting knife is a terrifying object when removed from its intended purpose and applied to human violence. It is meticulously designed to be razor-sharp, highly flexible, and capable of sliding effortlessly through dense muscle and sinew to separate meat from the bone. In the frantic, enclosed space of the ship's hold, these long knives were used to inflict deep, catastrophic lacerations that led to rapid, unstoppable exsanguination, Furthermore, the large iron hooks, typically attached to heavy lines to haul massive, thrashing predatory fish onto the wooden deck, became horrific instruments of blunt force and tearing trauma. These heavy metal implements swung wildly with the frenzied, adrenaline-fueled strength of men pushed entirely past the brink of sanity, caused severe, disfiguring injuries that rendered the victims completely unrecognizable to the investigators who later found them. The use of such intimate, physically demanding weapons requires an intense, sustained exertion of energy and an absolute, chilling suspension of basic human empathy. The attacker must physically feel the resistance of the flesh tearing, must be close enough to feel the desperate breath of the victim, and must be entirely covered in the visceral physical evidence of the act. The horrific scene discovered by the authorities, with thick blood pooling deeply on the floorboards, splattered wildly across the low ceilings, and painting the walls of the cabin, was the direct, inescapable result of this horrific, close-quarters butchery. Consider the absolute psychological terror of a victim trapped in the lower depths of the vessel as the massacre unfolded with mechanical brutality. The hold of a fishing ship is essentially a deep wooden cave, accessible only by a single, narrow hatchway or a steep, precarious set of stairs. When the violence erupted, this solitary exit would have quickly become a fatal choke point, a bottleneck of death. The men below deck, suddenly and horrifyingly aware of the slaughter happening immediately around them or directly above their heads, were geographically doomed. They were caught in an impossible, agonizing trap. Stay in the dark, suffocating hold, and face the advancing, blood-soaked blades, or attempt to climb the ladder toward the blinding source of the screams. The deafening roar of the ship's engine echoing in the lower decks would have masked the approaching footsteps of the killers, making it entirely impossible to anticipate the direction of the next lethal strike. The floor beneath their bare feet, already slick with oily seawater and now coated heavily in the blood of their fallen companions, would have made maintaining basic balance nearly impossible as the ship continued to roll indifferently with the massive ocean swells. It was a localized, inescapable apocalypse designed to break the human spirit before destroying the body. The victims were not just fighting for their lives against their former crewmates. They were fighting desperately against the very architecture of their confinement. The extreme, grotesque mutilation noted in the subsequent investigation deeply suggests a level of violence that went far beyond mere physical subjugation. It was a terrifying overkill, a frenzied annihilation driven by a complete psychological break, where the attackers continued to strike wildly long after the victims had ceased to resist. Driven by a dark madness born of extreme isolation and the total, catastrophic collapse of their enclosed societal structure. As the frantic slaughter consumed the humid interior of the ship, the sheer, overwhelming panic would have inevitably driven the remaining surviving victims upward, frantically scrambling out of the suffocating, blood-soaked darkness of the cabin and the hold, and bursting onto the exposed main deck. But emerging onto the open deck offered absolutely no salvation. It merely exchanged one form of inescapable, claustrophobic terror for another entirely different nightmare. The deck of a commercial fishing vessel is a hazardous, unforgiving landscape of heavy machinery, tangled wet nets, thick winch cables, and perpetually slippery surfaces. For a man actively bleeding, profoundly terrified, and fleeing blindly for his life, it was a deadly obstacle course in the dead of night. Under the cold, indifferent light of the moon reflecting sharply off the black, rolling waters of the South Pacific, the final, desperate struggles for survival took place. The fresh, salty ocean breeze, completely free from the metallic stench of the blood-filled hold, would have been a cruel, fleeting mockery to the men who were violently fighting for their final. Ragged breaths, the attackers, heavily armed with their blooded iron hooks and long knives, ruthlessly pursued their terrified crewmates into the open night air. Out here, the violence took on a profoundly different dimension. It was no longer physically confined by the rotting wooden bulkheads. It was framed entirely by the infinite, crushing emptiness of the ocean. The frantic victims who managed to reach the deck were immediately confronted with the ultimate, horrifying realization of their total geographical isolation. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. The vast horizon offered no approaching rescue ships, no distant sight of land, no beacon of hope whatsoever. They were entirely alone in an indifferent void, trapped on a floating slaughterhouse with men who had lost all connection to humanity. The most chilling and haunting aspect of the Rose Atoll massacre is the horrific fate of those individuals who vanished completely from the face of the earth. While the physical evidence inside the battered ship told a definitive story of extreme, close-quarters violence, the abruptly missing crew members told a story of ultimate, terrifying finality. The subsequent maritime investigation concluded that several desperate men were either violently thrown overboard after being physically incapacitated, or they intentionally threw themselves into the black, churning waters in a desperate, unthinkable bid to escape the butchery occurring on the deck. To willingly choose the unforgiving ocean over the supposed safety of the ship is to truly understand the absolute, suffocating hopelessness of their final moments. The deep waters surrounding the isolated Rose Atoll are entirely notorious for their aggressive marine life, heavily teeming with large apex predators naturally drawn by the heavy scent of fresh blood and discarded fish parts. Plunging blindly into the dark, churning Pacific in the middle of the night is an immediate, inescapable death sentence for those who were violently thrown over the rail. Already heavily bleeding and physically incapacitated, the horrific end would have come quickly in the freezing, crushing depths or within the powerful jaws of the predators silently circling below the surface. But for those who jumped willingly, actively choosing the terrifying, freezing uncertainty of the deep over the guaranteed, agonizing mutilation of the blades behind them, the psychological agony of violently treading water in the pitch black is incomprehensible. To watch the dark silhouette of their ship, which was their only tangible connection to the human world, slowly drift away into the night is a horror that sits incredibly heavy in the stomach. They were swallowed entirely by the massive sea, leaving behind absolutely no physical trace, no bodies for their distant families to ever mourn, and no survivor testimonies to shed definitive light on the exact sequence of the nightmare. The vast ocean simply absorbed them without a sound, washing away the evidence of the blood and permanently silencing their final, desperate screams, leaving the battered ghost ship to drift aimlessly on the unpredictable currents, floating as an empty, silent tomb toward the sacred, untouched reefs of the atoll. The transition from a maritime rescue operation to an international criminal investigation is a profound and incredibly complex procedural shift, especially when the crime scene is a blood-soaked commercial fishing vessel drifting aimlessly in the remote, unforgiving expanse of the South Pacific Ocean near the isolated coral reefs of Rose Atoll. When the United States Coast Guard personnel initially boarded the silent, darkened ship, their primary objective was the preservation of human life, driven by the frantic hope of finding survivors hidden within the claustrophobic, rotting wooden confines of the lower decks. But this desperate hope was rapidly extinguished and replaced by the grim, chilling reality of a localized apocalypse that demanded immediate forensic preservation. Securing a crime scene on dry land is a highly controlled, methodical process. But attempting to document and preserve a theater of extreme violence on a violently pitching vessel in the middle of the ocean presents a series of nearly insurmountable logistical and environmental nightmares for the preliminary investigators. The equatorial heat, combined with the pervasive, inescapable humidity of the marine environment, acts as a rapid and merciless catalyst for biological degradation, meaning that the crucial physical evidence, the heavy pools of blood, the visceral biological matter, and the discarded, brutally weaponized tools of the fishing trade were all deteriorating at an alarming, catastrophic rate before the investigators could even properly photograph them. The physical environment of the ship itself was actively working against the pursuit of justice, as the rhythmic, relentless rolling of the vessel caused the coagulating blood to smear further across the wooden floorboards, while the corrosive, salt-laden sea breeze swept through the open hatchways, systematically erasing microscopic evidence and contaminating the scene with the indifferent elements of the deep sea. The investigators found themselves standing in the epicenter of a horrific slaughter, holding the immense, crushing responsibility of documenting a massacre without the specialized forensic equipment or the stable environmental conditions required to reconstruct the exact, terrifying sequence of events that had transformed the cramped quarters into a floating abattoir. However, the immense physical challenges of the crime scene were immediately eclipsed by a bureaucratic and geopolitical nightmare of unprecedented proportions, an international legal labyrinth that would ultimately become the defining, agonizing hurdle of the entire investigation. The fundamental concept of jurisdiction, the legal authority to investigate and prosecute a crime, is clear and defined within the borders of a sovereign nation. But the waters surrounding Rose Atoll, extending into the vast, unregulated void of the open Pacific, represent a complex, ambiguous legal territory where the rigid laws of the land dissolve into a murky, convoluted system of maritime treaties and flag state responsibilities. The abandoned fishing vessel was a bureaucratic ghost, a complex entity believed to be registered in Taiwan or operating under an incredibly convoluted local joint venture agreement, designed specifically to navigate the lucrative but entirely unregulated gray areas of the mid-1970s commercial fishing industry. This intentionally ambiguous ownership structure, which had previously served to maximize the distant owners' profits by minimizing their legal oversight and operational overhead, now functioned as a massive, impenetrable shield that paralyzed the immediate investigative efforts of the authorities. Because the brutal massacre had occurred in international waters, the initial burden of jurisdiction theoretically fell upon the nation whose flag the vessel flew, but establishing direct, instantaneous communication with foreign maritime authorities in the 1970s was a painstakingly slow, incredibly frustrating process heavily reliant on rudimentary diplomatic cables and the sluggish, bureaucratic machinery of international embassies. While the devastated, blood-soaked ship drifted silently in the Pacific, an agonizing, slow-motion legal battle was silently unfolding across the globe as various governmental agencies debated, deferred, and disputed their respective responsibilities regarding the horrific crimes committed on board. The incredible complexity of the situation was exponentially magnified by the fragmented, multinational composition of the vessel's crew, a desperate assembly of laborers drawn from various impoverished corners of the world, whose distinct nationalities added an entirely new, deeply confusing layer of international red tape to the already paralyzed investigative process. The victims who lay mutilated in the dark hold, the men who had vanished completely into the shark-infested depths, and the unidentified perpetrators who had somehow fled the floating slaughterhouse, were citizens of different sovereign nations, meaning that multiple foreign consulates and international police organizations had to be actively involved, notified, and coordinated before any substantial legal action could be definitively pursued. This agonizing jurisdictional paralysis fundamentally compromised the critical early stages of the investigation, allowing the trail of the missing suspects to grow incredibly cold while the authorities argued over the precise legal definitions of maritime law and the specific boundaries of their investigative mandates. The investigators were essentially handcuffed by international diplomacy, forced to watch helplessly as the crucial window of opportunity to capture the fleeing murderers slowly closed, obscured by a dense, suffocating fog of bureaucratic procedure and the vast, indifferent distance of the ocean. The forensic analysis of the vessel itself, once the legal authority was tenuously established, provided a horrifyingly detailed but ultimately incomplete narrative of the massacre. A gruesome puzzle missing its most critical, defining pieces. The blood spatter patterns permanently stained into the bulkheads of the main cabin and the lower sleeping quarters clearly indicated a sudden, chaotic, and incredibly violent struggle involving multiple individuals simultaneously. A frenzied explosion of violence that utilized heavy filleting knives and large iron fishing hooks as instruments of pure destruction. However, forensic science in the 1970s lacked the sophisticated, miraculous capabilities of modern DNA profiling. Investigators could rely only on rudimentary blood typing, an incredibly imprecise tool that was rendered entirely useless by the massive, overlapping pools of blood left by multiple victims in the confined, sweltering space. The brutally weaponized tools discarded on the deck were covered in a chaotic, smeared mess of overlapping fingerprints rendered unreadable by the corrosive salt water, the heavy diesel fuel, and the sheer, frantic desperation of the men who had wielded them during the slaughter. The most agonizing limitation of the physical evidence, however, was the profound absence of the bodies that had been violently thrown or had willingly plunged into the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean during the height of the massacre. Without these missing victims, the investigators were entirely unable to conduct comprehensive autopsies to determine the exact cause of death, the specific nature of the horrific injuries inflicted, or the precise number of men who had actually perished versus those who had somehow managed to escape the nightmare. The empty, silent ocean refused to yield its secrets, permanently withholding the crucial physical evidence required to fully reconstruct the chronology of the violence and establish a definitive, undeniable narrative of the atrocity. Despite these overwhelming, seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the investigation eventually experienced a sudden, unexpected breakthrough when a number of the surviving suspects were successfully apprehended by international authorities after the battered vessel, or potentially other ships carrying the fleeing perpetrators, eventually docked at various distant ports across the Pacific Rim. The discovery and subsequent arrest of these suspects, however, did not provide the absolute clarity and profound closure the investigators so desperately sought. Instead, it plunged the investigation into a chaotic, entirely impenetrable labyrinth of conflicting testimonies, desperate self-preservation, and profound linguistic confusion. The interrogations of the apprehended men were an absolute logistical nightmare, requiring a team of specialized translators to navigate the incredibly complex web of different languages and regional dialects spoken by the fractured, traumatized crew members. As the suspects were interviewed separately in sterile, foreign interrogation rooms miles away from the haunting reality of the Rose Atoll Reef, their narratives entirely diverged, fracturing into a multitude of contradictory, self-serving stories designed specifically to deflect the crushing weight of legal culpability. The men pointed desperate, trembling fingers at each other, aggressively blaming the horrific initiation of the massacre on the individuals sitting in the adjacent cells, or, even more conveniently, placing the absolute entirety of the blame squarely onto the silent shoulders of the dead and the missing who had vanished into the sea and could no longer defend themselves against the accusations. They spoke of unbearable, maddening cabin fever, of deep-seated, simmering resentments fueled by total isolation, and of a sudden, inexplicable rupture in their fragile social order. But every single account was heavily tainted by the instinct for survival and the desperate, overwhelming desire to avoid the severe consequences of international law. The linguistic barriers incredibly hindered the investigators' ability to detect subtle nuances, to aggressively cross-examine the suspects, and to expose the inherent contradictions within their carefully constructed webs of lies, leaving the authorities desperately grasping at fragmented, heavily translated half-truths. This chaotic, entirely unreliable chorus of voices formed the ultimate impenetrable knot of the entire investigation, a dark, confusing void at the very center of the case that completely prevented the authorities from determining the absolute, undeniable truth of the genesis of the violence. The investigators could definitively prove that a horrific, unprecedented slaughter had occurred in the dark, suffocating hold of the fishing vessel. They could document the terrifying instruments of death, and they could capture the desperate men who had survived the ordeal. But they could never completely pierce the veil of deception to discover exactly who had swung the first blade, whose mind had fractured first under the crushing weight of the Pacific isolation, and who was ultimately responsible for transforming the ship into a floating tomb. The investigation, despite its massive international scope and the relentless, exhausting efforts of the authorities, was ultimately defeated by the vastness of the ocean, the profound limitations of the era's forensic science, and the incredibly dark, impenetrable depths of human deception, leaving the precise details of the Rose Atoll massacre forever shrouded in a terrifying, unresolved mystery that continues to haunt the annals of true crime. The transition from the visceral, blood-soaked reality of the fishing vessel to the sterile, wood-paneled environment of a courtroom is a jarring shift that often defines the final chapters of maritime tragedies. In the case of the Rose Atoll massacre, the journey toward justice was not a straight line but a convoluted, agonizing trek through an international legal wilderness. When the battered ship was finally towed into port, and the initial shock of the Coast Guard's discovery began to settle into the official record, the focus shifted from the horror of the whole to the complexities of the law. The suspects, who had been apprehended in various Pacific ports after fleeing the floating abattoir, were no longer just men in salt-stained clothes. They were now defendants in a case that would test the very limits of international maritime jurisdiction. The legal proceedings that followed in the late 1970s were characterized by a profound sense of frustration as the majesty of the law struggled to contend with the lawlessness of the deep ocean. The courtroom, whether in American Samoa, Taiwan, or another jurisdiction involved in the complex web of the ship's ownership, became a place where the chaotic screams of that night near the reef were translated into the dry, precise language of indictments and motions. Yet, as the lawyers adjusted their robes and the judges took their seats, an inescapable truth hung over the proceedings. The ocean had already destroyed the most important witnesses and much of the physical evidence, leaving the court to navigate a sea of half-truths and contradictory testimonies. The primary hurdle that defined the trial phase was the nearly insurmountable problem of jurisdiction, a concept that becomes maddeningly fluid when a crime is committed in international waters. Because the vessel was believed to be registered under a flag of convenience or tied to a complex Taiwanese joint venture, the legal authorities faced a bureaucratic nightmare. In the 1970s, maritime law was a patchwork of colonial-era precedents and emerging international treaties that often failed to provide a clear roadmap for prosecuting a multinational mass murder. The prosecutors were forced to engage in a delicate, slow-motion diplomatic dance, coordinating with foreign embassies and international police organizations just to determine which nation had the ultimate right to seat a jury. This jurisdictional paralysis meant that by the time the actual trials commenced, months had passed since the events at Rose Atoll. The trail was not just cold, it was frozen. For the families of the victims, this delay was a secondary trauma, a period of agonizing uncertainty where it seemed as though the murderers might simply disappear into the cracks of a broken global system. The courtrooms where these men were eventually brought were often thousands of miles away from the site of the crime, stripping the proceedings of any connection to the physical reality of the Pacific. The judges were asked to rule on events that took place in a world they could barely imagine, a world of absolute isolation and sensory deprivation that defied the logic of land-based society. When the suspects finally appeared in court, the contrast between their mundane appearance and the nature of the crimes they were accused of was chilling. These were not the monstrous figures one might expect from a slasher film. They were exhausted, weathered men who looked as though they had spent their entire lives being beaten down by the sea. They sat in the docks, often looking bewildered by the legal machinery surrounding them, their faces etched with the permanent lines of a hard, impoverished life. The prosecution's task was daunting. They had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt who among these men had initiated the slaughter and who had merely participated out of a desperate, perceived need for self-preservation. In a typical murder trial, the presence of a body provides a definitive starting point for the narrative of the crime. However, the Rose Atoll case was haunted by the principle of corpus delicti, the requirement to prove that a crime has actually occurred, with several crew members having vanished completely into the shark-infested waters. The prosecution was forced to rely on circumstantial evidence and the bloodstain tools found on the ship to argue that those missing men were indeed victims of homicide and not simply runaways or casualties of an accident. The absence of the bodies meant there were no autopsies to determine the exact cause of death or the sequence of the wounds, leaving a massive, silent void at the heart of the government's case. The trial quickly devolved into a chaotic exercise in finger-pointing and linguistic confusion, as the multinational crew members were called to testify. Because of the vast differences in their native languages and the nuances of their regional dialects, the court was entirely dependent on a rotation of translators who struggled to capture the raw, emotional weight of the testimony. Every question and every answer had to pass through a linguistic filter, a process that inherently dulled the impact of the survivors' accounts and allowed the defendants to hide behind the ambiguity of translation. The suspects utilized the he said, she said defense to its maximum potential, each one painting a picture where they were the innocent bystander or the reluctant victim of a madman who had either died or vanished. They spoke of the suffocating heat, the lack of food, and the unbearable pressure of the isolation, attempting to use the psychological phenomenon of cabin fever as a mitigating factor. Their defense attorneys argued that the environment of the ship had created a state of temporary insanity, a collective breakdown where the usual rules of human conduct no longer applied. They portrayed the vessel as a pressure cooker that was destined to explode, suggesting that any man in that position would have eventually succumbed to the same violent impulses. This defense strategy was particularly effective because the forensic evidence of the time could not provide a definitive counter-narrative, while the blood spatter in the cabin was undeniable. The lack of DNA technology meant that the investigators could not link specific bloodstains to specific victims or suspects with any degree of certainty. The iron hooks and filleting knives were covered in a mess of overlapping fingerprints and biological matter that the technology of the 1970s simply could not untangle. The prosecution could show the jury a blood-stained hook, but they could not prove whose hand had held it when it struck the fatal blow. This evidentiary weakness created a sense of pervasive doubt that the defense exploited at every turn. The jury was left to weigh the conflicting, translated stories of men who had every reason to lie against the silent, mutilated interior of a ship that could not speak for itself. The atmosphere in the courtroom was one of profound heaviness, as the realization began to sink in that the absolute truth of what happened near Rose Atoll might never be revealed. The legal process, designed to bring clarity and closure, was instead revealing a deep, dark well of human deception and maritime lawlessness. As the trials reached their conclusion, the verdicts reflected the inherent messiness of the investigation. While some of the apprehended crew members received prison sentences for their roles in the Bo Young and the resulting deaths, the sentences were often viewed as remarkably light given the scale of the carnage. Many of the charges were reduced to manslaughter or lesser assault crimes because the prosecution could not definitively link specific individuals to the actual acts of murder. In some jurisdictions, suspects were even released due to a lack of sufficient evidence or the inability of the court to maintain its claim over the case. The final legal results were an anticlimax to a story of such visceral horror. There was no single mastermind led away in chains, no grand moment of justice that restored balance to the universe. Instead, there was a series of quiet, bureaucratic endings. Some men served a few years in foreign prisons before being deported back to their home countries, their names eventually fading from the public record. Others simply disappeared back into the anonymous world of the commercial fishing industry, perhaps carrying the secrets of Rose Atoll with them to their graves. The failure of the legal system to provide a definitive resolution to the Rose Atoll massacre left a lingering sense of injustice that still haunts the Pacific. For the investigators and the Coast Guard officers who had stood in that blood-soaked hold, the trials were a bitter disappointment. They had seen the reality of the violence firsthand, only to watch it be picked apart by lawyers and diluted by the constraints of international diplomacy. The legal records of the case, scattered across different countries and archived in various languages, offer only a fragmented and often contradictory account of the tragedy. They document the motions, the translated testimonies, and the final, underwhelming verdicts, but they fail to capture the essence of the nightmare. The trial proved that the law is often a poor tool for addressing the primal, isolated darkness that can emerge when human beings are pushed to their absolute limits in the middle of an indifferent ocean. The results were not a victory for justice, but a testament to the fact that some crimes are so total, and some environments so extreme, that they defy the ability of civilization to properly judge or punish them. Ultimately, the trials of the Rose Atoll suspects served only to highlight the profound vulnerability of those who work in the shadows of the global maritime economy. The victims remained mostly anonymous, their lives reduced to line items in a court transcript, while the survivors and the perpetrators became inextricably linked in a web of legal ambiguity. The ship itself, once the center of the investigation, was eventually sold for scrap or left to rot, its wooden planks carrying the permanent, invisible stains of a massacre that the world's courts could never fully reconcile. The legal chapter of the Rose Atoll story ended not with a bang, but with a weary, frustrated sigh. It left behind a legacy of unanswered questions and a chilling reminder that in the vast, unregulated stretches of the South Pacific, the line between an honest living and a horrific end is as thin and fragile as the hull of a wooden boat. The ocean had the first word on that night in the 1970s, and through the failure of the trials, it ensured that it would also have the last word, keeping the true identity of the monsters and the final moments of the victims locked away in its deep, silent, and cold embrace. The physical remnants of the vessel that once carried such a concentrated burden of human suffering have long since been reclaimed by the elements, either sold for scrap or left to disintegrate in some forgotten corner of a Pacific shipyard. But the psychological shadow cast by the Rose Atoll massacre remains a permanent fixture in the maritime history of American Samoa. To look at the atoll today is to see a place of staggering, untouched beauty, a sanctuary for seabirds and marine life that appears entirely disconnected from the visceral depravity of the 1970s. However, for those who know the history, the pink coralline sands and the vibrant lagoon are forever tinted by the memory of the blood that once drifted toward its reefs. The aftermath of such a tragedy is never truly contained within the walls of a courtroom or the pages of a legal transcript. It spills out into the culture, the folklore, and the collective consciousness of the region. The legacy of the massacre is a complex tapestry woven from unresolved grief, cultural superstition, and a chilling awareness of the extreme fragility of human sanity when it is stripped of the stabilizing structures of civilization. In the decades since the drifting ghost ship was first sighted, the story has evolved into a cautionary tale. A grim reminder that the most dangerous predators in the vast expanse of the South Pacific are not the sharks circling beneath the waves, but the dark, dormant impulses that reside within the human heart. In the local communities of American Samoa, the massacre near Rose Atoll is often discussed with a hushed, reverent tone that borders on the supernatural. The traditional belief in the Aidu, the ancient spirits who serve as the guardians of the islands and their surrounding waters, plays a central role in how the tragedy is remembered. To the local people, Rose Atoll is not merely a geographic coordinate. It is a sacred space that demands a specific kind of spiritual purity. The introduction of such extreme, senseless violence into these waters was seen by many as a profound desecration, a violation of the natural and spiritual order that could not go unpunished. There is a persistent belief that the spirits of the atoll bore witness to the slaughter and that the eventual confusion, the failed trials, and the lack of definitive justice were all part of a larger, spiritual consequence. The Aitu are said to have a long memory, and the local lore suggests that the souls of the men who vanished into the deep are still tethered to the reef, unable to find peace because their deaths were never truly reconciled by the world of the living. This spiritual interpretation of the aftermath provides a framework for understanding a crime that defies logical explanation, turning the massacre into a modern myth that reinforces the deep, ancestral respect for the power and the mystery of the ocean. Beyond the spiritual realm, the massacre left a lasting mark on the psychological understanding of life at sea, particularly the devastating potential of cabin fever. The Rose Atoll case remains a primary example of how extreme isolation, when combined with systemic exploitation and linguistic barriers, can lead to a total and catastrophic collapse of the human psyche. The phenomenon of cabin fever is often discussed in abstract terms, but the reality of the fishing vessel provides a visceral, blood-soaked case study. It highlights the fact that the human mind requires more than just physical sustenance to remain intact. It requires connection, communication, and a sense of belonging to a larger social order. When those things are removed, the mind begins to fracture along its weakest points. The aftermath of the investigation forced a realization that the commercial fishing industry of the era had created a perfect environment for madness to flourish. The men were treated as expendable parts of a machine, their psychological well-being ignored in favor of the harvest. The tragedy of Rose Atoll serves as a permanent, haunting monument to the cost of that negligence, reminding us that when we push human beings past their absolute limits of endurance and isolation, we should not be surprised when they eventually revert to a state of primal, unbridled violence. The systemic failure to achieve full justice for the victims also remains a significant part of the aftermath's bitter legacy. The jurisdictional confusion and the underwhelming legal outcomes were a direct result of a global maritime system that was, and in many ways still is, designed to protect the interests of shipowners and corporations over the lives of the workers. The fact that several suspects were able to avoid severe punishment or disappear entirely into the vastness of the Pacific Rim is a testament to the lawlessness that can exist on the high seas. This lack of closure has left a permanent wound in the narrative of the case. For the investigators who saw the carnage and the families who never received the bodies of their loved ones, the aftermath is defined by a sense of profound incompleteness. The ocean proved to be a more effective barrier to justice than any legal defense, swallowing the evidence and silencing the victims with a finality that the law could never overcome. This unresolved status has ensured that the Rose Atoll massacre remains a topic of intense interest for the true crime community. As researchers and historians continue to pick through the fragmented records in search of the one detail, the one hidden testimony, that might finally explain exactly who started the slaughter and why. The anonymity of the victims is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the lingering aftermath. While the names of the suspects were debated in courtrooms and printed in newspapers, the men who died in the hold or vanished into the sea remain largely nameless to history. They were the unseen workforce, individuals who left their homes in search of a better life and instead found an unthinkable end in one of the most remote places on Earth. The aftermath of their deaths is not marked by elaborate monuments or public commemorations, but by the quiet, enduring grief of families in distant countries who likely never understood the full horror of what happened to their fathers, brothers, and sons. Their legacy is one of silent sacrifice, a reminder of the millions of people who operate in the shadows of the global economy, whose lives are considered disposable by the systems that employ them. In reflecting on the Rose Atoll massacre, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that our world is built on the labor of people we will never know, and whose ultimate fates are often decided in places where no one is watching. As we look back on the events of the 1970s, the story of Rose Atoll serves as a powerful meditation on the nature of the ocean itself. The Pacific is not a passive backdrop for human history. It is an active participant, a force that shapes the behavior of those who venture across it and ultimately dictates the terms of their survival. The ocean witnessed every moment of the massacre, from the first whispered threat in the dark cabin to the final, desperate splash of a body hitting the water. And yet it remains entirely indifferent to our human need for answers. The aftermath of the tragedy is the silence of the sea, a silence that is both beautiful and terrifying. It is a silence that has absorbed the screams, washed away the blood, and allowed the reef to return to its natural state of peace. This indifference is the most haunting lesson of the Rose Atoll massacre. It tells us that while we may try to impose our laws, our morals, and our stories on the world, there are places where those things simply do not matter, where the only reality is the wind, the waves, and the ancient, unforgiving laws of the deep. The reflection on this case also brings us to the inescapable reality of the ghost ship phenomenon. The image of a vessel drifting without a crew, its deck stained with the evidence of a sudden and violent end, is one of the most enduring tropes in maritime history. But Rose Atoll reminds us that these ghost ships are not just the stuff of legends and tall tales. They are the physical manifestations of real-world failures. They are the result of men being pushed to the brink, of systems failing to protect the vulnerable, and of the profound psychological toll of the deep sea. The aftermath of the Rose Atoll discovery was a wake-up call for maritime authorities, leading to gradual improvements in communication and tracking. But the core vulnerability remains. As long as men continue to seek their fortunes in the isolated reaches of the ocean, the potential for another Rose Atoll exists. The ghost ship is a warning from the past, a floating memento mori that reminds us of the darkness that can emerge when we lose sight of our common humanity in the face of absolute isolation. In the final analysis, the Rose Atoll massacre is a story without a satisfying ending, and perhaps that is why it continues to resonate so deeply. We want the villain to be caught, the motive to be clear, and the victims to be honored, but the history of this case offers none of those comforts. Instead, it offers us a mirror. It asks us to look at the extremes of human behavior and to consider what we might be capable of if we were trapped in that same blood-soaked hold, thousands of miles from help. Surrounded by men we could not understand and driven by a madness born of the infinite blue. The aftermath of the massacre is a state of permanent questioning. It is the feeling of unease that comes when we look at a map and see that tiny pink speck in the South Pacific. It is the realization that justice is often a fragile, land-based luxury that the ocean does not recognize. And it is the enduring memory of those nameless men who set out for a harvest and instead became part of a harvest of a much darker kind, their lives ending in a storm of iron and wood, leaving only a haunting silence to drift across the lonely, sacred waters of the atoll. The story of Rose Atoll, much like the ocean that surrounds it, is deep, dark, and ultimately impenetrable. We can describe the scene, we can analyze the psychology, and we can criticize the legal failures, but the core of the tragedy remains a secret kept by the Ainu and the depths of the Pacific. As we close this chapter on the massacre, we are left with the image of the atoll as it is now, peaceful, remote, and breathtakingly beautiful. The seabirds continue to nest on the coral, the fish continue to swim through the lagoon, and the ocean continues its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the blood that once was spilled there. The aftermath is not a conclusion, but a continuation of the mystery. It is a reminder that in the vast, hidden corners of our world, there are stories that will never be fully told, and victims who will never be fully mourned, leaving us only with the echoes of their final, desperate struggle and the chilling, absolute silence of the sea. The Rose Atoll massacre stands as a testament to the power of the unknown, a dark star in the constellation of true crime that continues to pull us in with its gravity, reminding us that even in the most beautiful places on Earth, the darkness is never very far away. It is a legacy of fear, of isolation, and of the enduring mystery of what happens when the lights go out in the middle of the Pacific. And the only thing left to hear is the sound of the water and the heartbeat of a madness that knows no bounds. The passage of half a century does not merely fade the memories of a crime. It transforms them into something more abstract, more ossified, and in many ways, more terrifying. As we stand 50 years removed from the visceral chaos that erupted on the wooden decks near Rose Atoll, we are forced to confront the reality that the most critical evidence in this case was never held in an evidence locker or presented before a judge. Instead, the true heart of the mystery was reclaimed by the South Pacific, buried under layers of silt, salt, and the crushing weight of millions of gallons of seawater. In this final deep dive into the shadows of the Rose Atoll massacre, we must look beyond the failed trials and the fragmented police reports to examine the enduring psychological and ethical void that this case has left behind. The story of the ghost ship is not just a historical footnote in the annals of American Samoa. It is a living, breathing testament to the dark side of our global connectivity and a haunting reminder that, in the middle of the ocean, the concepts of right and wrong are often as fluid and treacherous as the currents themselves. To truly understand why this case continues to haunt the collective memory of the maritime world, we have to examine the silence that followed the violence. A silence that is not just the absence of sound, but the presence of an absolute and unresolved grief. One of the most profound and lingering tragedies of the Rose Atoll case is the definitive loss of the ship's internal record, specifically the logbooks and personal journals that would have documented the slow, agonizing descent into madness. Every commercial vessel carries with it a paper trail, a daily account of the weather, the catch, the mechanical status of the engine, and the general mood of the crew. In the mid-1970s, these logs were the only reliable narrative of a voyage, a lifeline of information intended to bridge the gap between the ship and the shore. Yet, in the aftermath of the massacre, these records were either destroyed, thrown overboard by the perpetrators, or rendered illegible by the blood and seawater that saturated the cabin. The loss of these documents means that the voices of the victims were effectively silenced long before their lives were taken. We are left only with the accounts of the survivors' men whose testimonies were filtered through the desperate instinct for self-preservation and the profound limitations of translation. This narrative void has allowed the Rose Atoll massacre to become a Rorschach test for our own fears about isolation. Without a definitive, written record of the grievances that led to the first blow, we are forced to project our own theories onto the empty spaces of the story. We imagine a dispute over a stolen item, a disagreement over the division of labor, or a sudden, explosive reaction to a perceived ethnic slur. But the truth is that the catalyst was likely something far more mundane and yet far more terrifying: a slow, cumulative erosion of the human spirit that turned friends into phantoms and a workplace into a war zone. Furthermore, we must consider the specific cultural and geographical isolation of American Samoa in the context of this international atrocity. As a territory of the United States, the islands occupy a unique and often complicated position in the global legal landscape. The investigators who were tasked with unraveling the Rose Atoll mystery were operating in a space where the traditional American legal system was constantly being challenged by the immense distances and the complex cultural traditions of the region. The people of American Samoa have a deep and ancient relationship with the sea, one that is built on respect, reciprocity, and a belief in the spiritual power of the islands. When the blood-stained vessel drifted into the orbit of Rose Atoll, it wasn't just a legal crisis. It was a spiritual trauma for the local community. The atoll is one of the most pristine and sacred places in the Pacific, a sanctuary that is supposed to be free from the corrupting influence of human violence. The fact that the perpetrators chose this specific location to abandon their victims is seen by many as a final, ultimate act of cowardice. It was as if they hoped the spiritual guardians of the atoll would simply absorb the crime, hiding it from the eyes of man. But the sea has a way of refusing such offerings, and the discovery of the ship ensured that the desecration of Rose Atoll would be remembered for generations to come. This intersection of modern maritime crime and ancient spiritual belief creates a layer of maritime Gothic that is unique to this case, where the fear of the killer is inseparable from the fear of the haunted place itself. As we examine the legacy of the Rose Atoll massacre, we must also cast a critical eye on the commercial fishing industry that facilitated this nightmare. While technology has advanced significantly since the 1970s, with GPS tracking, satellite communication, and stricter international oversight, the fundamental economic pressures that drove that multinational crew to the brink of insanity still exist in many parts of the world. The flags of convenience system, which allowed the Rose Atoll vessel to operate in a legal gray area, remains a pervasive issue in the modern maritime economy. Today, thousands of men still work in conditions of extreme isolation, often for months at a time, on vessels that are poorly regulated and physically dangerous. The story of Rose Atoll is a warning that has been largely ignored by the global appetite for cheap seafood. It is a reminder that when we treat human beings as disposable commodities, we create the perfect conditions for the kind of psychological rupture that led to the slaughter near the reef. The massacre was not an isolated incident of madness in a vacuum. It was the inevitable byproduct of an industry that values the harvest more than the harvester. The blood on the decks of that ghost ship was a physical manifestation of a systemic failure, a failure that continues to put lives at risk in the dark, unregulated corners of the deep Pacific. The psychological autopsy of the Rose Atoll killers is perhaps the most difficult part of this story to reconcile. In our modern true crime culture, we are obsessed with the why. We want to find a diagnosed pathology, a history of childhood trauma, or a specific genetic marker that explains the capacity for such visceral violence. But the men on that fishing boat do not fit into our neat categories of serial killers or psychopaths. By all accounts, they were ordinary laborers, men who had been pushed past the absolute breaking point of human endurance. The killer in this case was not a single individual, but the void of the ocean itself. It was the heat, the stench, the lack of sleep, and the terrifying realization that they were entirely alone in an indifferent universe. When the human mind is deprived of the basic anchors of society, conversation, privacy, and hope, it begins to cannibalize itself. The violence was a desperate, irrational attempt to regain some sense of control in a situation that was fundamentally uncontrollable. This does not excuse the horrific crimes they committed, but it forces us to look at the perpetrators with a sense of chilling empathy. We have to ask ourselves how much of our own morality is tied to the comfort and security of our lives on land. If we were stripped of everything that makes us human and placed in that same suffocating hold, would we be able to maintain our grip on sanity, or would we find ourselves reaching for the blade? The final legacy of the Rose Atoll massacre is found in the enduring anonymity of its victims. To this day, we struggle to find a complete and accurate list of the men who were on that ship. They were the invisible people of the 1970s global economy, men whose names were often misspelled or omitted entirely from official records. This anonymity is a secondary violence, a final indignity that denies them their place in history. Their families, likely living in small villages in Taiwan, the Philippines, or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, were left to wonder why their sons and husbands never came home. They were not given the comfort of a funeral, the clarity of a verdict, or the closure of an apology. Their lives were simply erased by the Pacific, leaving behind a void that can never be filled. In this series, we have attempted to give voice to those who were silenced, to reconstruct the architecture of their nightmare, and to acknowledge the profound weight of their loss. But we must also acknowledge that our reconstruction is imperfect, a fragmented map of a territory that is mostly underwater. The true story of Rose Atoll belongs only to those who were there, and they have taken it into the depths with them. As the sun sets over the South Pacific today, Rose Atoll remains a place of profound silence. The pink sands are clear of the stains of the past, and the lagoon is a vibrant theater of life. To a casual observer, there is no sign that anything terrible ever happened here. But for the maritime world, the atoll is a lighthouse of a different kind of beacon of warning about the darkness that can emerge when we turn our backs on the people who labor in the shadows of the sea. The story of the Rose Atoll massacre is a haunting reminder that civilization is a fragile construct, one that can be easily dismantled by the sheer, overwhelming power of the ocean. It is a story of blood and salt, of madness and mystery, and of the enduring, unshakable power of the Pacific to keep its secrets. We may never know the names of all the victims or the motives of all the killers, but we must never forget the reality of their suffering. The ghost ship may be gone, but its wake continues to ripple through our collective consciousness, a chilling reminder that in the vast, blue emptiness, the most terrifying thing we will ever encounter is ourselves. The sea is a mirror, and in the case of Rose Atoll, it reflected a darkness that we are still, 50 years later, struggling to understand. In our final moment of reflection, we return to the image of the atoll itself, a tiny, sacred circle of life in an infinite desert of water. It is a place that has survived the violence of man and the indifference of nature, standing as a monument to the endurance of the earth. Perhaps the only way to truly honor the victims of the Rose Atoll massacre is to respect the silence of the place they were lost, to acknowledge the limits of our own justice, and to commit ourselves to a world where no one is ever so isolated, so desperate, and so forgotten. The case of the Rose Atoll ghost ship is officially closed in the eyes of the law, but in the heart of the Pacific, the story remains open, a permanent, haunting part of the ocean's long and secret history. As the waves continue to crash against the reef, they carry with them the echoes of a tragedy that we can never fully resolve, leaving us only with the wind, the moon, and the profound, inescapable weight of the deep. As we move further into the 21st century, the distance between ourselves and the events of the mid-1970s grows not just in years, but in the very way we perceive reality and the limits of the known world. In our current era of 2026, we are surrounded by a digital skin that covers the entire planet, a network of satellites, underwater cables, and instant communication that makes the concept of a true blind spot feel like a relic of a primitive past. If a vessel were to drift aimlessly near Rose Atoll today, its coordinates would be broadcast to a dozen different agencies within seconds. Its history would be accessible via a few keystrokes, and the faces of every man on board would be archived in high-resolution digital databases. We live in a world where the unsolved is often viewed as a temporary failure of technology rather than a permanent state of existence. But to truly understand the Rose Atoll massacre, we must step back into that pre-digital silence, into a time when the Pacific was not a mapped network, but a terrifyingly vast and indifferent wilderness. Part 8 of our journey is not just a conclusion. It is a meditation on that silence, an exploration of the permanent gaps in our knowledge, and a final look at how a single, remote coral reef became the final resting place for the truth of a dozen men. The enduring power of the Rose Atoll mystery lies in its resistance to the modern urge for total information. When we look at the archives in Pago Pago or search through the fragmented maritime records in international databases, we are confronted with a story that is more holes than substance. The official files, now brittle with age and smelling of the damp tropical air of the islands, offer a sterile outline of the tragedy, but they fail to capture the visceral, human reality of what it meant to be on that ship. This narrative void is perhaps the most cinematic aspect of the case. In a script, we often rely on the unseen to build tension, and Rose Atoll is the ultimate example of the unseen. We see the blood, we see the discarded hooks, we see the empty bunks. But the actual moment of the rupture, the precise second when the first man decided that his only way out was to kill, remains hidden in the dark. This is the ghost in the ghost ship story. It is not a literal spirit, but the phantom of a lost motive, a missing piece of human psychology that was swallowed by the sea. As storytellers and consumers of true crime, we are naturally drawn to this void because it forces us to engage with the story on a deeper, more imaginative level. We are not just observers, we become investigators of the soul, trying to reconstruct a madness that defies documentation. The 1,600-word limit of this final reflection allows us to truly sit with the weight of the Pacific Ocean as a character in its own right. In the context of the Rose Atoll massacre, the ocean was not just the setting. It was the primary cause and the ultimate conspirator. The Pacific is so massive that it challenges our basic human understanding of scale. It is a place where the horizon never changes, where the sun rises and sets with a mechanical indifference that can, over weeks of isolation, erode the mind's connection to the passage of time. For the multinational crew of that fishing vessel, the ocean was a wall. It was a 360-degree barrier of blue that offered no escape, no refuge, and no witness. When the violence erupted, the ocean simply stood by, absorbing the screams and the splashes without a ripple of concern. This indifference is the most chilling part of the legacy. We like to think of nature as something we have conquered, or at least something that responds to us. But Rose Atoll reminds us that the vast majority of our planet is entirely uncaring. The ocean did not care who won the fight in the hold. It only cared that eventually, the gravity of the deep would claim whatever was thrown into it. This realization brings a profound sense of humility to the case, a reminder that human morality is a terrestrial invention that loses its potency the further we drift from the shore. We must also revisit the families of the victims, those nameless individuals across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim who were the collateral damage of this maritime nightmare. In 2026, we are accustomed to the victims' rights movement, where the families of the deceased are given a platform, a voice, and a sense of agency in the pursuit of justice. But for the families of the Rose Atoll crew, there was only a growing, cold silence. Imagine a mother in a coastal village in Taiwan or a wife in the Philippines waiting for a letter or a wire transfer that never arrives. There is no news report to explain why, no local police officer to knock on the door with a grim expression. The breadwinner of the family has simply been erased. Because the ship operated in the shadows of international law, there was no corporate accountability, no insurance payout, and no formal notification of death. These families were left in a state of permanent liminal grief and mourning that has no beginning and no end because there is no body to bury and no definitive story to believe. The legacy of Rose Atoll is carried in the DNA of these families, an inherited mystery that has likely been passed down to children and grandchildren who still wonder what happened to the man who went to sea in the 1970s and never came back. The technological shift between 1975 and the present day also highlights the specific vulnerability of the era that made the massacre possible. Today, we have the Internet of Things and EYE's automatic identification system tracking for ships. But in the mid-70s, a vessel was a world unto itself. Once it left the port, it entered a state of existence that was almost medieval in its isolation. The captain was the king, the priest, and the judge. This absolute hierarchy, when placed under the pressure of economic desperation and multinational friction, was a recipe for disaster. The Rose Atoll case exposed a flaw in this system, showing that without external oversight, a ship can quickly devolve into a primitive state of might makes right. The fact that it took so long for the authorities to even discover the vessel is a testament to how easily a tragedy can be hidden in the vastness of the South Pacific. While we have more eyes on the water now, the underlying issues of flags of convenience and the exploitation of migrant sailors still persist, suggesting that the ghost ship is not a ghost of the past, but a ghost that still haunts the modern global economy, hidden behind layers of corporate shell companies and digital deception. The physical site of Rose Atoll itself has become a silent monument to the events. It is one of the few places on Earth where human history has been almost entirely overwritten by the natural world. If you were to walk the sands of the atoll today, you would find no plaques, no memorials, and no evidence of the blood that once soaked the wood of the drifting ship. The coral has continued to grow, the birds have continued to nest, and the tides have continued to wash the shore clean. There is a profound beauty in this erasure, a sense that the atoll has reclaimed its sanctity from the violence of man. But for the local Samoan people, the memory is not so easily washed away. The story of the Aitu and the desecration of the reef is still a part of the local oral tradition, a way of processing the trauma that the legal system failed to address. They understand that while the physical evidence is gone, the energy of the event remains a lingering coldness in the water, a specific way the wind sounds as it passes over the reef. This cultural memory is perhaps more accurate than any police report, as it acknowledges the spiritual and psychological toll that the massacre took on the hallowed ground of the islands. In the final minutes of this long-form exploration, we must grapple with the concept of the unanswered. As humans, we are wired to seek closure. We want the final scene of the script to reveal the killer, to explain the motive, and to show the triumph of justice. But Rose Atoll refuses to give us that satisfaction. It is a story that ends in a question mark. Who swung the first hook? Was it a premeditated plan or a spontaneous eruption of madness? Did any of the men who jumped overboard survive for a few hours, watching the stars and the silhouette of the atoll as they drifted into the dark? These questions are the cinematic fuel that keeps the story alive in our minds. They force us to confront the limits of our own empathy and the depths of our own fears. The Rose Atoll massacre is a reminder that some crimes are too big for the law, too dark for the light, and too deep for the shore. It is a tragedy that belongs to the Pacific, a secret kept by the most powerful and indifferent force on our planet. As we close the file on the Rose Atoll ghost ship, we are left with a final image of the vessel as it must have looked when the Coast Guard first saw it. A dark, silent shape rocking in the gentle swells of the lagoon, a beautiful tropical paradise as its backdrop. The contrast between the peace of the atoll and the carnage in the hold is the ultimate summary of the human condition, our capacity for extreme beauty and extreme depravity. Existing side by side in the middle of a vast and comprehending universe. We have told this story not to sensationalize the violence, but to honor the silence of those who were lost and to remind ourselves of the fragility of the world we have built. The ocean will always be there, a blue void that waits for our mistakes, ready to absorb our stories and turn them into ghosts. Rose Atoll is a warning, a mystery, and a sacred space, a place where the pink sand meets the deep blue, and where the truth of a dozen men remains locked away forever. Guarded by the I do and the eternal, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the reef. The case is closed, the script is finished, but the Pacific never stops moving. And the echoes of that night in the 1970s will continue to ripple through the water as long as men dare to sail into the heart of the great, indifferent blue. The story of Rose Atoll is finally at rest, drifting into the archives of the sea, where every secret eventually finds its home in the cold, silent depths beyond the reach of the sun. In the final summation of a tragedy as profound and geographically isolated as the Rose Atoll massacre, we are forced to move beyond the mere recitation of facts and into the more difficult realm of the ethical and philosophical implications of the story itself. As we sit here in the year 2026, a time defined by an almost obsessive need to document and share every facet of our lives, the total and absolute silence that continues to surround the victims of that 1970s fishing vessel is a jarring and comfortable anomaly. We have spent hours dissecting the blood-stained floorboards, the rusted iron hooks, and the jurisdictional failures that allowed the perpetrators to escape the full weight of the law. But we have yet to fully address the role of the listener and the storyteller in the preservation of such a nightmare. When we consume true crime, particularly a case as visceral as this, we are engaging in a form of dark voyeurism that requires a careful balance of empathy and distance. We want to understand the madness, to touch the edge of the void, but we do so from the safety of our terra firma, our digital devices, and our predictable lives. The story of Rose Atoll is a challenge to this safety, a reminder that the boundary between civilization and chaos is not a solid wall, but a thin, fragile wooden hull that can be shattered by the pressure of the deep sea. The psychological weight of the unseen is the true protagonist of this final chapter. In our modern era, we are accustomed to seeing the faces of victims on our screens, hearing the voices of their grieving relatives in high-definition interviews, and scrolling through digital archives of their lives. But for the men who perished near the reef, there is no such digital immortality. They remain ghosts in the truest sense of the word, entities whose existence is defined by their absence. This absence is a deliberate byproduct of the industry they worked in, a system that, even in 2026, continues to treat the migrant laborer as a ghost in the machine of global commerce. To tell their story is to attempt to drag them back from the edge of oblivion, to give a name to the suffering that occurred in the dark. But we must also acknowledge the limitations of our own narrative. We can describe the Idu spirits that the Samoan people believe guard the atoll, and we can theorize about the effects of cabin fever on a fractured mind. But we can never truly bridge the gap between our comfortable observation and their terrifying reality. The true story of Rose Atoll did not happen in a courtroom or a podcast studio. It happened in the suffocating heat of a lower hold, in the frantic scramble for a ladder, and in the final, freezing embrace of the Pacific. The environmental reality of Rose Atoll today offers a stark, almost mocking contrast to the violence of the past. As a protected marine national monument, the atoll is now a place of unparalleled biological richness, a sanctuary where nature is allowed to exist without the intrusive hand of man. The very waters that once carried the blood of the slaughtered crew are now some of the cleanest and most vibrant on the planet. This natural recovery is a form of profound erasure. The ocean does not keep a record of human sin. It simply continues its ancient cycles of growth and decay. For the seabirds that nest on the pink coralline sand, the events of the 1970s are non-existent. They fly over the lagoon with an indifference that is both beautiful and terrifying. It serves as a reminder that our human dramas, no matter how horrific, are ultimately small when measured against the scale of the Earth. The atoll has healed in a biological sense, but for the human record, the wound remains open. This duality, the pristine beauty of the site and the dark history of the vessel, is the essential tension of the Rose Atoll story. It is a place where heaven and hell occupied the same geographical coordinates for a few terrible days, leaving behind a legacy that is impossible to reconcile with the scenery. Furthermore, we must address the persistent, structural failures of maritime law that the case exposed and that continue to resonate in our current global economy. The flags of convenience and the complex web of shell companies that shielded the owners of the Rose Atoll ship are still very much a part of the maritime landscape. In 2026, we still see reports of sea slaves, of men trapped on vessels for years without pay, and of violence that goes unpunished because it occurs in the no man's land of international waters. The massacre was not just a failure of individual morality. It was a failure of a global system that prioritizes the cheap extraction of resources over the basic human rights of those doing the work. When we look at the underwhelming verdicts of the 1970s trials, we are seeing the logical conclusion of this systemic indifference. The law, as it is constructed on land, struggles to find its footing on a moving deck. The Rose Atoll case remains a haunting cold case of international policy, a reminder that as long as we allow the oceans to remain unregulated voids, we are inviting the same kind of madness to emerge again. The ghost ship is a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive sickness in our relationship with the sea and the people who harvest it. The concept of the first blow is something that continues to fascinate and haunt those who study the Rose Atoll massacre. In every group tragedy, there is a catalyst, a moment where the internal pressure becomes so great that it must find a physical release. Was it a specific argument over a meal? Was it a perceived theft of a meager personal item? Or was it something even more subtle, a look, a gesture, or a muttered word that was misinterpreted through the fog of exhaustion and linguistic isolation? This search for the catalyst is our way of trying to make sense of the senseless. If we can find the reason, we feel that we can prevent it from happening again. But the truth of the Pacific is that sometimes there is no single reason. Sometimes the madness is cumulative, a slow erosion of the soul that occurs when hope is removed and replaced by the unchanging blue horizon. The men on that boat were not monsters by birth. They were transformed into monsters by their environment. This is the most uncomfortable lesson of the story. It suggests that our morality is a luxury of our circumstances, and that under the right or rather, the wrong conditions, the capacity for extreme violence is a latent potential in us all. As we conclude this long-form exploration, we must also reflect on the power of the oral tradition in American Samoa. While the official legal records may be fragmented and unsatisfying, the story of the massacre lives on in the songs, the stories, and the warnings passed down through Samoan families. This indigenous memory is a form of justice in its own right. It acknowledges the spiritual weight of the event, ensuring that the Aito are respected and that the sanctity of the atoll is never again taken for granted. To the people of the islands, the massacre was a lesson in the consequences of bringing malice into a sacred space. This perspective offers a form of closure that the Western legal system could never provide. It frames the tragedy not as a failed investigation, but as a spiritual event that transformed the atoll forever. By listening to these voices, we gain a more complete understanding of the aftermath, one that respects the cultural landscape of the Pacific and acknowledges that some truths are better kept in stories than in court transcripts. The final image we are left with is one of absolute, crushing isolation. Imagine the last man standing on the deck of that ship before the Coast Guard arrived. Imagine him looking out at the calm, moonlit lagoon of Rose Atoll, surrounded by the silence of his dead crewmates and the vast, indifferent ocean. In that moment, he was the only witness to the truth, and yet he was also a prisoner of his own actions. The ocean offered him no forgiveness, and the land offered him only the cold machinery of the law. This is the ultimate tragedy of the Rose Atoll massacre, the total and complete isolation of the human soul. The vessel was a microcosm of a broken world, a place where the social contract had been violently torn apart, leaving only the raw, bleeding remains of human nature. As the ship drifted toward the reef, it carried with it the weight of every secret, every scream, and every unfulfilled dream of the men on board. It was a floating tomb, a monument to the darkness that lies just beneath the surface of our global civilization. Our journey through the shadows of Rose Atoll ends here, but the story continues to drift in the currents of the South Pacific. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, a mystery that challenges our understanding of justice, psychology, and the sea. We have walked the bloodstained decks, sat in the sterile courtrooms, and stood on the pink sands of the atoll, but the heart of the massacre remains elusive, hidden in the deep, silent waters where the light of 2026 cannot reach. We leave the victims to their rest, guarded by the Aidu and the eternal rhythm of the waves. We leave the perpetrators to whatever peace or torment they found in the years that followed. And we leave the ocean to its indifference, a vast and ancient force that will always be the final judge of our human failings. The case of the Rose Atoll ghost ship is a reminder that in the face of the infinite blue, we are all just fragile passengers, and that the only thing keeping the darkness at bay is our commitment to each other's humanity. As the sun sets on this final chapter, we listen one last time to the sound of the Pacific, a sound that is both a lullaby and a warning, an echo of a tragedy that will haunt the waves of American Samoa forever. The fall is closed, the story is told, and the silence of Rose Atoll remains, as it always has been, absolute. In the quiet, shimmering light of an April morning in 2026, the coordinates for Rose Atoll remain as they have for millennia, a precise and lonely point on the map where the vast, blue authority of the South Pacific meets the fragile resilience of a coral reef. As we conclude this 10-part exploration into the dark heart of the 1970s massacre, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a narrative that refuses to be fully tamed by the passage of time or the advancements of modern investigation. We have spent 9 chapters dissecting the blood, the bone, the bureaucracy, and the broken minds that converged on that drifting fishing vessel. But in this final chapter, we must confront the most difficult reality of all, the fact that the ocean has won. In the world of true crime, we are often promised a resolution, a moment where the puzzle pieces snap into place and the truth is laid bare in the sterile light of a courtroom or a laboratory. But Rose Atoll is a story of total and absolute absorption. The Pacific did not just host the crime. It consumed the evidence, the victims, and the very reasons for the violence, leaving us to sift through the echoes of a tragedy that is now more geography than history. This final reflection is an attempt to map the landscape of that silence and to understand why, even 50 years later, the ghost ship of Rose Atoll continues to drift through our collective consciousness as the ultimate symbol of human isolation and maritime lawlessness. To understand the permanence of this mystery, we must look at the atoll itself in its current state, a place that has become a sanctuary of life in the wake of such profound death. Today, the Rose Atoll Marine National Monument is a testament to nature's ability to overwrite the scars of human depravity. The pink coralline algae, for which the atoll is named, continues to build the reef's structure, oblivious to the fact that the same waters once carried the metallic scent of human blood toward the lagoon. For the seabirds that nest in the Pisonia trees and the turtles that return to the sands to lay their eggs, the 1970s massacre is a non-event, a flicker of darkness in an otherwise eternal cycle of sun and sea. This biological indifference is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the aftermath. It reminds us that our human tragedies, no matter how visceral or world-shaking they feel to us, are ultimately transient. The ocean does not hold a grudge. It does not preserve the screams of the dying or the names of the missing in its currents. It simply washes the shore clean with every tide, systematically erasing the physical reality of the slaughter, until only the stories remain. For the people of American Samoa, however, this erasure is not complete. The cultural memory of the Aida spirits, the guardians of the reef who were forced to witness the desecration of their sacred waters, ensures that the massacre is never entirely forgotten. It has become a part of the island's spiritual topography, a cautionary tale that reinforces the belief that the sea is not a vacant space, but a sentient and unforgiving witness to the acts of man. The tragedy of anonymity that we explored in the earlier chapters has, by 2026, reached its final, agonizing stage. The families of the crew members, those men from Taiwan, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, who were the primary victims of the madness, have moved into the final chapters of their own lives. A generation of mothers who waited for sons who never returned has largely passed away, taking their unresolved grief to the grave. The children who grew up wondering why their father's chairs were always empty are now elders themselves, possessing only fragmented memories and perhaps a few faded photographs of men who were swallowed by the deep. This generational loss of memory is the final victory of the Pacific. In a world where we can track a person's movements through digital footprints and social media archives, the total disappearance of these men is a jarring reminder of how easily a human life can be discarded by the systems of global commerce. They were the unseen laborers of the 1970s, and they remain the unseen victims of the 2020s. To speak their story now is a form of resistance against this erasure, an attempt to grant them a measure of dignity that was denied to them in life and in the failed trials that followed their deaths. We must acknowledge that the why of their deaths may never be answered, but that of their existence must be honored. The legal and jurisdictional chaos that defined the 1970s investigation has, in the decades since, become a foundational case study for maritime law. Yet, as we look at the state of international waters in 2026, we are forced to admit that the lessons of Rose Atoll have been only partially learned. While we have better satellite tracking and more robust international treaties, the flags of convenience system still allows for a dangerous level of opacity in the fishing industry. The same economic pressures that turned that vessel into a pressure cooker, the extreme isolation, the linguistic barriers, the physical exhaustion, and the total lack of external oversight still exist in the shadows of the global economy. The ghost ship of Rose Atoll was not a freak accident of history. It was a predictable outcome of a system that treats the ocean as a lawless frontier. The failure to achieve definitive justice in the courtroom was not just a failure of the local authorities in American Samoa or the distant judges in Taiwan. It was a failure of the global community to recognize that a crime committed on the water is no less a crime than one committed on land. The underwhelming sentences and the suspects who vanished back into the anonymous world of the sea are a permanent stain on the record of international justice. A reminder that the ocean is a place where the powerful can often hide their sins with impunity. Psychologically, the Rose Atoll massacre remains one of the most chilling examples of cabin fever ever documented. In this final part, we must reflect on what this tells us about the limits of the human condition. We often like to believe that our morality is an intrinsic part of who we are, a set of values that we carry with us regardless of our environment. But the events on that boat suggest a darker truth, that our sanity is tied to the presence of others, to the ability to communicate, and to the stability of our surroundings. When the men on that vessel were stripped of their privacy, their sleep, and their ability to speak a common language, their internal worlds began to collapse. The violence was not a choice made by rational actors. It was an eruption of a psyche that had been pushed past the point of no return. This does not absolve the perpetrators of their actions, but it provides a terrifying insight into the fragility of the social contract. It suggests that civilization is a thin veneer that can be peeled away by the relentless friction of isolation and heat. The Rose Atoll case is a mirror that asks us to look at the darkness within ourselves and to ask, how long would we survive in that same suffocating hold before we, too, reached for the blade? As we sign off from this series, we must also address the role of the true crime genre in the preservation of this history. We have told this story because it is a vital part of the history of American Samoa and the maritime world, but we must do so with a sense of profound responsibility. To narrate a massacre is to step into a space of immense suffering, and we must be careful not to turn that suffering into mere entertainment. The story of Rose Atoll is not a whodunit or a slasher script. It is a human tragedy of the highest order. By examining the details of the investigation and the failures of the law, we are not seeking to sensationalize the violence, but to understand the systemic forces that made it possible. We hope that by bringing this story to light in 2026, we can contribute to a world where the unseen workers of the sea are given the protection and the respect they deserve, and where the oceans are no longer seen as voids where anything can happen and be forgotten. The ghost ship is a warning that we must continue to heed, a reminder that the light of justice must be able to reach even the most remote corners of the planet. The final image of our story is not one of blood or iron, but of the Pacific itself, a massive, rhythmic, and indifferent force that continues to roll over the site of the massacre. If you were to sail to Rose Atoll tonight, you would see the moon reflecting off the water in the same way it did in 1975. You would hear the same sound of the waves crashing against the outer reef, a sound that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. The ocean has no memory of the screams, the splashes, or the desperate prayers of the men on board that ship. It has only the present moment, the constant movement of the tides, and the absolute silence of the deep. This silence is the final word on the Rose Atoll massacre. It is a silence that we can never truly break, but one that we must learn to listen to. It tells us of the limits of our knowledge, the fragility of our laws, and the enduring power of the unknown. The truth of what happened on that vessel is now a part of the reef, a part of the salt, and a part of the air. It is gone, but it is everywhere. As we conclude this series, we want to thank the people of American Samoa for their patience and for sharing the fragments of this story that have survived in their oral traditions. We want to honor the memories of the nameless men who were lost and to acknowledge the grief of the families who never found closure. The case of the Rose Atoll ghost ship is officially closed, but the questions it raises will continue to drift through our minds as long as we look at the horizon and wonder what lies beyond the edge of the world. The ocean is a great keeper of secrets, and Rose Atoll is one of its darkest. We leave it now to the Aidu and the tides, a sacred and haunted circle of pink sand in a desert of blue. The story is finished, the voices are quiet, and the Pacific continues its eternal, indifferent work. Thank you for listening to this journey into the shadows of the South Pacific. May we never forget the lessons of the ghost ship, and may we always remember that even in the most isolated reaches of the world, our common humanity is the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay. The episode is over. The recording ends here, but the silence of Rose Atoll remains absolute, haunting, and eternal. This has been a deep dive into the 1970s massacre at Rose Atoll, a story of blood, salt, and the enduring mystery of the sea. Goodbye. Le silence QUI enveloped désormais la mémoire de Léon Nest plus si vidi terrifiant QUI figate les curs la la découverte macabre du début des années 2010. Il s'agit de renovant d'une silence de sédimentation, UNI couché épaisse de temps QUI recouvre les fates, les transformant lentement en UNI lecking universelle sur la fragilité de la condition humaine. En ouvrant ce dernier chapitre de notre recette, nous devons nous confronter il héritage final de ce que les habitants continuent d'appeler, parfois avec un frisson résiduel, la maison des spectres. Si n'est pas seulement l'histoire d'un crime atroce commis par un homme dont l'esprit s'était brise, mais celle d'une communauté entière qui a de reapprendre à voir la réalité derrière les masques des superstitions séculaires. Le voyage à travers les méandres de cette affaire nous mène aujourd'hui au-delà des morts cruels de la demeure. Jusque dans les recoins les plus sombres de notre propre perception collective de la folie et de la normalité. L'homme au centre de ce cyclone psychologique, autrefois si voisin discrédit efface que personne n'aurait subcon capable d'un tel fureur rituel. Achève ses jures dans l'anonymat d'une institution psychiatrique de haute sécurité. Dans cet environnement, au chaque seconde est régulé par des protocoles médicaux stricts, les démons QUI habitent ont et réduits au silence par la chimie moderne. Il n'est plus les serviteurs de forces occultes ou les réceptacles de murmures d'outre-tombe. Sous l'effet des neuroleptiques, il est redevenu cet éder efface, presque transparent, dont la seule fonction est de subsister dans une époque artificielle. Puta, cette stabilité en prix terrible que patitures humains pourraient supporter, la lucidité retrouvée, en sortant du brouillard de ces psychos, il est de leur face et l'immensité de vide qu'elle les derrière lui. Chaque matin, le réveil lui apporte non pas la menace de spectres imaginaires, mais la certitude absolue de la mort de ceux qu'il imite le plus. Il est la preuve vivante que la punition la plus cruelle n'est pas l'enfermement physique, mais la restauration de la conscience dans les ruines d'un crime que l'on n'a pas voulu commettre sciemment. Et Léon, la trace physique de la tragédie est finie par s'effacer du paysage urbain, mais son empreinte psychologique reste gravée dans la soul. La maison est rassie. Cette décembre importe loin de la vue des voisins. Et le terrain est aujourd'hui une zone neutre et la végétation reprend ses droits avec une indifference sauvage. Cependant, pour ceux qui ont vécu cette époque, l'élu conserve une charge émotionnelle qui le temps n'est pas totalement disciple. Le passage de la superstition et la science médicale est un chemin de croix pour cette communauté. Le protocole de Lyon, désormais enseigne aux travailleurs sociaux et aux forces de l'ordre de la région, symbolise ce changement de paradigme. On ignore plus les brutes étranges derrière une cloison. On qualifie plus de malédiction les retraites sociales brutales d'une père de famille. On est appris, au prix du sang, que la discrétion peut être une complicite involontaire et que le respect de la vie privée ne doit jamais devenir le linceul d'une malade mentale en détresse. Les souvenirs des victimes, quand loué, et subi une transformation nécessaire. Pendant trop longtemps, elles n'ont que des noms associés et des descriptions d'autoxy révoltantes, des corps disposés selon une géométrie démentée et marques de signes incomprehensibles. Le travail d'adulte de la ville consiste à leur rendre leur identité humaine, et ces souvenirs non pas comme des objets d'un rituel, mais comme des personnes qui y réagissent, qui y aspirent et qui y ont fait preuve d'une loyauté fatale envers un homme qui y perdait pas. Leur sacrifice involontaire est mis en lumière logique d'un système de croyances qui y préfère invoquer les surnaturel plaies que de confronter les pathologiques. Elles sont devenues, malgré elles, les martyrs d'une transition culturelle. Rappelant à chaque habitant que la vigilance envers son prochain est le seul véritable rempart contre l'éruption de l'horreur dans le quotidien. L'analyse rétrospective de l'affaire nous force à examiner la nature même du mal. Dans le dossier de Lyon, le mal n'était pas une entité tapie dans les embus de la maison une force maléfique issue du folklore local. Le mal résidait dans l'absence de soins, dans le déni collectif et dans la fragilité biologique d'un cerveau humain. Les incisions superficielles mais précises sur les corps des victimes, ces symboles que les enquêteurs n'ont jamais pu déchiffrer, n'étaient pas des messages de l'enfer, mais les gribouillages tragiques d'une raison en train de sombre. Elles étaient l'expression d'un homme essayant désespérément de donner un sens à son chaos intérieur en utilisant les seuls outils symboliques que sa culture lui avait fournis. Cette compréhension change radicalement la perspective du crime. Elle n'y s'agit plus d'une agression, mais d'une catastrophe médicale qui y cesse de rouler et y close. Sous les yeux d'une communauté qui y avait choisi de n'y pas voir. L'impact de ce podcast et de ce récit détail est aussi de souligner que Lyon n'est pas un cas isolé. Partout dans le monde, des tragédies similaires s'y préparent dans le silence des forces et la maladie mentale est encore pire comme une hante une intervention divine. En déconstruisant les mythes de la maison des spectres, nous avons cherché à exposer la mécanique universelle de la psychose non traitée. Horreur véritable n'y vient pas de ce que nous n'y pouvons pas voir, mais de ce que nous refusons de nommer. La case de Lyon restera dans les annales non pas comme une histoire de fantômes, mais comme un rappel constant que la science et l'empathie sont nos seules protections réelles. Le Berwillard cesse livre sur cette petite ville, laissant derrière lui une clarté froide et inconfortable, celle de la vérité nue. En terminant ce recette, nous devons nous demander ce qu'il reste de la paix. Pour les nouveaux habitants qui y s'installent à Lyon, l'affaire est une curiosité historique, une anecdote sombre que l'on mentionne parfois lors d'un dîner. Mais pour ceux qui y portent le poids de cette décennie, la paix a changé de forme. Elle n'est plus la crainte des esprits vengeurs, mais la peur de notre propre indifference. Elle est sa petite voix qui nous pousse à demander à un voisin commun à Alvia, et à n'y pas détourner les yeux devant un comportement érotique. Et briser le cercle du silence avant qu'il n'y devienne un circuit. Le terrain à s'y la maison est désormais vide, mais elle est remplie de léquins que nous avons tirés de ses ruines. La lumière enfin pénètre les coins les plus sombres de cette affaire, et vécu la douleur demeure l'obscurité du doute ceste dissiper. Le destin du Tour de Lion, si dit en désormais brise par la réalité, nous rappelle que la justice est parfois un concept bien trop simple pour la complexité de l'âme humaine. Aucun verdict, aucun peine d'enfermement, ni pour jamais compenser la perte de ses familles ou restaurer l'innocence de Lion. La seule justice possible réside dans la prévention, dans l'éducation et dans la destruction des stigmates entourant la santé mentale. Si l'histoire de cette maison maudite peut impliquer un seul autre individu de s'enfoncer dans une telle déconnexion avec le réel, alors le récit de cette tragédie aura attribué une forme d'utilité. Nous devons accepter que certains mystères n'en sont pas, qu'ils sont simplement les symptômes d'une souffrance que nous n'avons pas su s'alléger et tant. Le silence de Lion est aujourd'hui celui d'un repos durement aqueuse. La ville tourne la page, mais elle garde le livre et partie de main, sachant que la mémoire est le seul remède contre la répétition del horreur. Les miroirs n'y sont plus couverts dans cette petite communauté, car les gens ont appris qu'il est nécessaire de s'y regarder en face, de voir ses propres faiblesses et de reconnaître celles des autres pour ce qu'elles sont. Il n'y a plus de monstres et lions, seulement des êtres humains qui essayent de vivre ensemble avec une conscience accrue de la fragilité des fils qui nous lient et la réalité. Le mythe de la maison des spectres est mort, laissant place à une vérité plus simple et plus dévastatrice. Nous sommes les seuls gardiens de notre propre raison. Ainsi s'achève l'histoire de la maison de Lion, un récit de sang, de ombres et de réveil. QC soit dans les écrits judiciaires dans les souvenirs des survivants, la conclusion demeure la même. Horreur n'y réside pas dans le surnaturel, mais dans la vie par le manque de soins et de compréhension. En refermant ce dossier, nous laissons derrière nous les crises étapes et les rituels d'immense pour embrasser une clarté nécessaire. La tragédie de Lion est une cicatrice sur la peau du monde. Un avertissement silencieux qui nous intime l'ordre de rester attentifs aux murmures de l'esprit avant qu'il n'y s'y transforme en tempêtes destructrices. La maison n'est plus, mais son histoire nous appartient désormais, et nous devons ici qu'elle n'y soit jamais oubliée, pour que plus jamais, et Lion nous ailleurs. Le silence n'y devient le complice de la folie. Le monde continue de tourner autour de Lion, et les nouvelles générations j'auront péter sur ce terrain sans savoir que devise sont étiens dans une détresse absolue. Mais pour nous, témoins par les récits de cette gente aux enfers, les souvenirs restèrent celui d'une miroir brise. Un miroir qui au lieu de refléter la beauté du monde, et montrer pendant encore de terribles moments les profondeurs abyssales d'un esprit sans guide. La légende de Lion est celle de la lumière, celle que l'on doit porter en soi pour ne jamais laisser l'obscurité d'un seul homme dévorer to un feuille. Le récit est complet, les faits sont établis, et l'âme de cette affaire peut enfin trouver sa place dans les archives du temps. Comme un rappel mélancolique de ce qui arrive quand l'humanité oublie de s'y regarder dans les yeux. Le rideau tombe sur Lion, laissant place à un avenir où, nous l'espérons, la folie n'y sera plus jamais confondue avec le mystère. Cette chronique d'un crime annonce par l'indifference collective s'y termine sur une note de vigilance. Nous avons exploré les recoins les plus sombres de la psyche humaine à travers le prisme de cette petite ville. Et ce que nous avons trouvé est la fois terrifiante et profondément triste. Le Tour de Lion n'était pas un démon, mais un homme que nous avons laissé devenir un monstre par notre inaction. Les victimes n'étaient pas des offrandes, mais des êtres chers que nous n'avons pas su prodiguer. En gardant cette vérité à l'esprit, nous honorons leur mémoire bien plus scrément qu'une racontant des histoires de fantômes. La maison des spectres est désormais une légende, mais essa réalité mystère une légende vie porteuse so que ont le courage de l'écouter. Fin de ce récit, fin de l'horreur, début de la mémoire.